Behind the golden gates and marble walls of royal palaces, there exists a world most people will never see. A world where protocol dictates every movement, where one wrong step can end a career, and where silence often speaks louder than words. But on one particular evening in the autumn of 2019, a royal guard named Marcus Chen broke that silence. What happened in those 47 seconds would not only change his life forever, but would also expose the hidden pressures faced by those who serve royalty and the impossible choices they must make when duty conflicts with conscience. This is not a fairy tale. This is what really happened when a man decided that some lines should never be crossed, even by princes. Marcus Chen never imagined he would become part of royal history. When he joined the Royal Protection Service 6 years earlier, he had been a quiet, methodical man who followed orders without question. His file was spotless. His record was impeccable. Supervisors described him as reliable, professional, and utterly forgettable in the best possible way. That was exactly what made him perfect for his role. Royal guards were meant to be invisible furniture, present but unnoticed, protective but never intrusive. The evening started like countless others before it. Marcus arrived at Kensington Palace at 3 in the afternoon, 2 hours before his shift officially began. He always came early. It gave him time to walk the corridors he would patrol, to check the sightlines, to mentally rehearse evacuation routes he prayed he would never need to use. The palace was hosting a private dinner that evening, nothing unusual. Princess Charlotte, third in line to the throne, was entertaining a small group of guests in the blue dining room. The guest list had been vetted weeks in advance. Security protocols had been reviewed and approved. Everything was routine. Marcus changed into his uniform in the guards' quarters, a cramped room in the basement that smelled perpetually of coffee and boot polish. His colleague, James Whitmore, was already there, adjusting his tie in a small mirror that hung crooked on the wall. "Private dinner tonight," James said without looking away from his reflection. "Should be quiet. 8 guests, all pre-approved. We're positioned outside the dining room as usual." Marcus nodded, checking his radio and earpiece. Communication was essential in their work. They operated on specific channels, with codes for different situations. Code Silver meant a medical emergency. Code Red meant an immediate threat. Code Black meant evacuation. In 6 years, Marcus had never once had to use Code Black. "Who's on the guest list?" Marcus asked, though he had already reviewed the names that morning. James rattled them off from memory. Lord and Lady Pemberton, the French ambassador and his wife, 2 members of Parliament, and Prince Edward Ashford with his wife. Prince Edward Ashford. Marcus had encountered him before. The prince was a distant cousin to the royal family, wealthy from inherited estates, charming in public, and known among palace staff for being demanding in private. Marcus had stood guard during 3 previous events where Prince Edward attended. Each time, the prince had treated staff with casual dismissiveness, the kind of behavior that came from never having to consider consequences. The dinner was scheduled to begin at 7. By 6:30, Marcus and James had taken their positions in the corridor outside the blue dining room. The hallway was decorated with paintings that cost more than Marcus would earn in a lifetime. Beneath their feet, Persian rugs muffled their footsteps. The palace always smelled faintly of flowers and furniture polish, a scent Marcus had come to associate with extreme wealth and careful maintenance. Guests began arriving promptly at 7. Lord Pemberton, a portly man in his 60s, arrived first with his wife, who wore enough jewelry to fund a small hospital. They were followed by the French ambassador, a tall man with silver hair who spoke English with a perfect accent. The 2 members of Parliament arrived together, both looking slightly uncomfortable in formal wear. Finally, Prince Edward Ashford arrived with his wife, Caroline. Marcus watched them enter with trained neutrality. Prince Edward walked with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. He was in his early 40s, handsome in a conventional way, with dark hair going grey at the temples. His wife Caroline seemed quieter, walking a half-step behind him with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Princess Charlotte greeted each guest personally at the entrance to the dining room. She was in her late 20s, known publicly for her charity work and privately for her genuine kindness towards staff. Marcus had guarded her at dozens of events. She always remembered names, always said thank you, always treated security personnel like human beings rather than invisible machines. In a family where some members never made eye contact with guards, Charlotte stood out. The heavy doors closed behind the last guest. Marcus and James settled into their positions, one on each side of the entrance. Their job now was to wait, to listen without hearing, to watch without seeing. They were trained to identify sounds that indicated problems, breaking glass, raised voices, anything unusual. But royal dinners were typically predictable affairs, polite conversation over multiple courses, wine flowing freely but not excessively, everyone performing their roles in the elaborate theatre of aristocratic life. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. Marcus heard the muffled sounds of conversation and occasional laughter through the doors. Servers moved in and out, carrying trays of food prepared by palace chefs. Each server was someone Marcus recognized, staff who had been vetted and trained in palace protocol. They moved silently, efficiently, ghosts in white uniforms. At 8:15, Marcus heard a sound that made him alert. It was subtle, but his training had taught him to notice subtle things. A chair scraping against the floor with more force than necessary. Then silence, longer than the comfortable pauses in dinner conversation. James noticed it too. They made eye contact but remained in position. It could be nothing. Probably was nothing. Then they heard Princess Charlotte's voice, clear even through the thick doors. "I think perhaps we should move to the drawing room for coffee." It was earlier than planned. Dinner typically lasted until 9 at minimum. Marcus checked his watch. 8:17. Something had shifted the evening schedule. The doors opened and guests began filing out. Most looked normal, continuing their conversations as they moved down the corridor toward the drawing room. But Marcus noticed Caroline Ashford looked pale, and Princess Charlotte's smile seemed forced. Prince Edward was the last to exit, and Marcus saw immediately that the prince had been drinking heavily. His face was flushed, his movements slightly uncoordinated. He paused in the doorway, looking back into the dining room as if he had forgotten something. Then he turned and followed the others, walking with the exaggerated care of someone trying to hide their intoxication. James and Marcus followed at a discreet distance. The group moved to the green drawing room, a smaller, more intimate space with sofas and comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace. Coffee service had been prepared, along with after-dinner drinks for those who wanted them. The guests settled into their seats, and the conversation resumed, though Marcus sensed a tension that had not been there before. Protocol dictated that guards remained outside the drawing room as well, but the door was left partially open, as was customary for informal gatherings. Marcus could see into the room without being obtrusive. He watched as Princess Charlotte poured coffee, playing the role of gracious hostess despite whatever had disrupted dinner. Prince Edward had positioned himself on a sofa next to Princess Charlotte. Too close, Marcus thought. The princess shifted slightly, creating space between them, but Prince Edward seemed not to notice. Or chose not to notice. He was talking loudly, dominating the conversation, his voice carrying into the corridor. "The problem with modern royal duties," Prince Edward declared, "is that we've forgotten how to enjoy the privileges of our position. We're so concerned with public opinion that we've become servants to the very people who should be serving us." Several guests looked uncomfortable. The French ambassador coughed politely. Princess Charlotte set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "I find serving the public to be the most meaningful aspect of my role," she said quietly but firmly. Prince Edward laughed, a sound without genuine humor. "Of course you do, my dear. You've always been the dutiful one. But duty can become a cage if we're not careful. Sometimes we need to remember that certain privileges come with our bloodlines." He reached out and placed his hand on Princess Charlotte's arm as he said this. It was casual, perhaps meaningless. But Marcus saw Charlotte tense. She removed her arm smoothly, reaching for a napkin, but Prince Edward moved closer, closing the space she had created. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. This was not his concern. Royal guests behaved as they wished, and unless someone was in physical danger, guards did not intervene in social interactions. He had been trained specifically on this point. The royal family did not want security staff acting as social police. They were there for actual threats, not uncomfortable moments. But Marcus kept watching. Training told him to observe without interfering, but instinct told him something was wrong. Prince Edward's wife Caroline sat across the room, staring into her coffee cup as if she could disappear into it. She had seen this before, Marcus realized. This was a pattern, not an isolated incident. The French ambassador stood, announcing that he and his wife needed to depart due to an early morning commitment. It was a polite fiction, an escape route. His wife rose immediately, and they made their goodbyes with practiced diplomatic grace. The two members of Parliament seized the opportunity to excuse themselves as well. Suddenly, the intimate gathering had shrunk considerably. Only Lord and Lady Pemberton, Prince Edward and his wife, and Princess Charlotte remained. Princess Charlotte stood. "Perhaps we should call it an evening. It's been a lovely dinner, but I have an early engagement tomorrow." It was a clear dismissal, delivered with perfect politeness. Lord and Lady Pemberton understood immediately and began their goodbyes. Caroline Ashford stood as well, relief visible on her face. But Prince Edward remained seated. "Surely we're not ending the evening already," he said, his words slightly slurred. "The night is young and we've barely had time to talk properly. I'm afraid I must insist," Princess Charlotte said, still polite but with steel underneath. "I have commitments tomorrow that require an early start." Prince Edward stood, but instead of moving toward the exit, he stepped closer to Princess Charlotte. "You work too hard," he said, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "You need someone to help you relax, to remember that life is meant to be enjoyed." Charlotte stepped back, her expression hardening. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm quite content with my schedule. I'll have staff show you out." She turned toward the door, toward where Marcus stood, but Prince Edward caught her wrist. It was not a violent grab, but it was firm, stopping her movement. Charlotte looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face, her expression transforming from polite irritation to genuine anger. "Let go," she said quietly. Prince Edward smiled, the dangerous smile of someone who believed rules did not apply to him. "Don't be so dramatic. I'm simply suggesting we continue our conversation without all these other people around. Surely after 6 years of knowing each other we can speak freely." Marcus felt his body moving before his mind fully registered the decision. He stepped through the doorway into the drawing room, his movement drawing every eye in the room. This was a violation of protocol. Guards did not enter rooms during private royal gatherings unless summoned, or unless there was a clear emergency. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said, his voice calm and professional, addressing Princess Charlotte. "My apologies for interrupting, but you have an urgent telephone call that requires immediate attention." It was a complete fabrication. There was no telephone call, but it provided Charlotte with an escape and gave Prince Edward a face-saving reason to release her. For a moment, nobody moved. Prince Edward's hand remained on Charlotte's wrist. Marcus could see the calculation in the prince's eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of whether this guard could be dismissed or whether the situation required compliance. Princess Charlotte pulled her wrist free, taking advantage of Prince Edward's momentary distraction. "Thank you, Chen," she said, using Marcus's surname in the formal manner expected. "Please escort our guests to their cars." It was a clear order, and Marcus was being given explicit permission to fulfill it. He stepped further into the room, positioning himself between Prince Edward and Princess Charlotte. The prince's eyes narrowed, anger flashing across his face before he controlled it. "This is highly irregular," Prince Edward said coldly. "I don't appreciate being interrupted by staff." "My apologies, sir," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. "But the princess has duties that require her attention. If you'll follow me, I'll ensure you reach your vehicle safely." Caroline Ashford had already moved toward the door, desperate to leave. Lord and Lady Pemberton had witnessed the entire exchange with the carefully blank expressions of people who would later discuss this at length in private. Prince Edward looked at Princess Charlotte one more time, as if considering whether to push the issue. But Charlotte had already turned away, her posture radiating dismissal. "This is absurd," Prince Edward muttered, but he moved toward the door. Marcus followed at a distance that was respectful but ready, his body language calm but his mind running through scenarios. If Prince Edward became aggressive, if he turned violent, what were the protocols? Guards were authorized to protect members of the royal family from any threat, but Prince Edward was also technically royal, however distantly. The hierarchy was complex, the rules unclear when royals conflicted with other royals. They walked through the palace corridors in tense silence. Caroline Ashford walked quickly, several paces ahead of her husband. Lord and Lady Pemberton maintained a diplomatic distance. Marcus and James bracketed the group, professional and alert. When they reached the entrance where cars waited, Caroline practically ran to her vehicle. The Pembertons made brief, awkward goodbyes and departed quickly. Prince Edward paused before getting into his car. "We defied." He turned to face Marcus, his expression cold and calculating. "You've made a serious mistake tonight," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand the consequences of embarrassing me?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "My duty is to ensure the safety of Her Royal Highness. I acted appropriately based on the situation I observed."
"You acted inappropriately by entering a private gathering uninvited."
"You invented a telephone call that didn't exist. You inserted yourself into matters that are none of your concern." Prince Edward stepped closer, his breath smelling of wine and cigars. I will be filing a formal complaint. Your career is over. He got into his car without waiting for a response. The vehicle pulled away, tail lights disappearing into the night. James stood beside Marcus, both of them watching the departure in silence. That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen, James finally said. Marcus did not respond. His heart was racing, adrenaline slowly draining from his system, leaving behind the cold realization of what he had done. He had violated protocol. He had fabricated an emergency. He had inserted himself into a situation that would now require explanation, documentation, and almost certainly disciplinary review. They returned inside, where palace staff were quietly cleaning up from the evening. Marcus and James returned to their positions, but the rest of the shift passed in uncomfortable silence. At midnight, when their replacement guards arrived, Marcus filed his report, documenting everything that had occurred. He wrote carefully, sticking to observable facts, describing Prince Edward's behavior, Princess Charlotte's clear discomfort, and his decision to intervene based on his assessment of the situation. He submitted the report to his supervisor and went home, knowing that by morning his actions would be under review by people whose careers depended on maintaining aristocratic relationships and avoiding scandal. He had protected Princess Charlotte, but in doing so, he had created a problem that the palace would now have to manage. Marcus lived alone in a small flat 20 minutes from the palace. He barely slept that night, replaying the evening's events, questioning every decision, wondering if he had overreacted, knowing he would make the same choice again if given the opportunity. By dawn, he received a text message from his supervisor requesting his presence at an emergency meeting at 8 o'clock. When Marcus arrived at the palace that morning, the atmosphere had changed. Staff who normally greeted him with casual friendliness now avoided eye contact. He was directed not to the guards' quarters but to an administrative office on the second floor, a room he had never entered in 6 years of service. His supervisor, Commander David Walsh, sat behind a desk with Marcus's report in front of him. Walsh was a career security professional, 25 years with the Royal Protection Service, respected by his staff but ultimately loyal to the institution rather than individuals. Two other people sat in the room. A woman from Palace Human Resources and a man Marcus did not recognize, wearing an expensive suit that marked him as legal counsel. "Sit down, Chen," Walsh said, his voice carefully neutral. Marcus sat, his back straight, hands folded in his lap. He felt oddly calm. Whatever happened next was beyond his control now. "I've read your report," Walsh continued. "I've also received a formal complaint from Prince Edward Ashford alleging inappropriate conduct, insubordination, and fabrication of an emergency to embarrass him in front of other guests. These are serious accusations." "Yes, sir," Marcus said quietly. "The complaint demands your immediate termination and suggests legal action for defamation and interference with royal family affairs." Walsh paused, looking directly at Marcus. "Do you stand by your report?" "Yes, sir, every word." The Human Resources representative spoke for the first time. "Mr. Chen, you understand that entering a private gathering without being summoned is a violation of protocol? And that fabricating an emergency call is grounds for immediate dismissal?" "I understand the protocols," Marcus replied. "I also understand that my primary duty is to ensure the safety of members of the royal family. I observed behavior that made Princess Charlotte uncomfortable and potentially unsafe. I acted on that assessment." "Potentially unsafe?" The legal counsel leaned forward. "Can you articulate what specific threat you observed? Was Prince Edward armed? Did he make explicit threats? Was there any indication of imminent physical danger?" Marcus chose his words carefully. Prince Edward was intoxicated. He physically prevented Princess Charlotte from leaving by grabbing her wrist when she attempted to withdraw from the conversation. She verbally told him to let go, and he refused. That constitutes unauthorized physical contact with a member of the royal family, which I am trained to prevent. The room fell silent. The legal counsel made notes. Walsh's expression remained unreadable. "We've also received a statement from Princess Charlotte," Walsh said finally. "Would you like to know what she said?" Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Charlotte's statement would determine everything. If she supported Prince Edward's version, claimed Marcus had overreacted, his career was over. If she confirmed his account, it would become a political nightmare for the palace, pitting one royal against another. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. Walsh picked up another document. Princess Charlotte states, and I quote, "Officer Chen acted with professionalism and appropriate judgment. I was grateful for his intervention. Prince Edward's behavior made me uncomfortable, and I appreciate that my security team prioritized my well-being. Officer Chen should be commended, not criticized." End quote. Marcus felt something release in his chest, a tension he had not fully acknowledged until that moment. However, Walsh continued, and Marcus's relief evaporated, we have a significant problem. Prince Edward is demanding action. He has connections throughout the aristocracy and government. He's threatening to go public with claims that palace security staff are out of control, that guards are inventing emergencies and embarrassing guests. This creates a public relations nightmare. So what happens now? Marcus asked. The legal counsel answered, we have 3 options. 1. We terminate your employment, issue a public apology to Prince Edward, and this goes away quietly. 2. We conduct a formal investigation, which will take weeks, generate extensive documentation, and likely end up in the media regardless of the outcome. 3. We reach an informal resolution that satisfies all parties. What does an informal resolution look like? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. You accept a temporary reassignment to a different position, something quieter, less visible. Prince Edward withdraws his complaint. Princess Charlotte's statement remains private. The incident is recorded as a misunderstanding resolved through proper channels. Everyone moves forward. In other words, Marcus thought he would be punished quietly to satisfy an angry prince, while the palace maintained plausible deniability about what really happened. It was not justice, but it was survival. And if I refuse? Marcus asked. Walsh spoke this time, his voice heavy. Then we proceed with option 1 or 2. Either you're terminated, or this becomes a protracted investigation that will consume months of your life and probably end your career anyway. The palace cannot afford to be seen as protecting staff who violate protocol, regardless of their intentions. Marcus sat in silence, processing the reality. He had done the right thing. Princess Charlotte had confirmed it. But the right thing carried costs that institutions were unwilling to pay. The palace prioritized stability over justice, appearance over truth. I need time to think, Marcus said. You have 24 hours, the legal counsel replied. After that, we'll be forced to make decisions without your input. Marcus left the meeting feeling hollowed out. He had spent 6 years serving the royal family, believing that duty and honor mattered, that protecting people was the highest calling. Now he understood that duty was complicated, that honor was negotiable, that institutions protected themselves first and individuals only when convenient. Marcus walked through London in a daze after the meeting. The city moved around him with its usual chaos, tourists taking photographs, business people hurrying to appointments, street vendors calling out their wares. Nobody noticed him. Nobody cared that his entire career hung in the balance, that he had done something right and was being punished for it. The world continued its indifferent rotation, while his personal world crumbled. He found himself at a small park near the Thames, sitting on a bench watching boats move along the river. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from James, asking what happened, offering support. Marcus did not reply. He needed silence, needed to think through his options without the pressure of immediate decisions or well-meaning advice. Option 1 meant accepting defeat. He would lose his job, the work he had dedicated 6 years of his life to perfecting. He would be marked as the guard who overstepped, who embarrassed a royal guest. Finding similar security work would be nearly impossible. His reputation would be destroyed to preserve Prince Edward's ego. Option 2 meant fighting. It meant months of investigations, lawyers, documentation, testimony. It meant his life becoming public, his actions scrutinized by media outlets hungry for royal scandal. Princess Charlotte would be dragged into it, forced to testify publicly about being made uncomfortable by a distant royal relative. The palace would ultimately protect itself, not him. He would lose anyway, but more slowly, more painfully. Option 3 meant survival. He would accept a reassignment, something less prestigious, less visible. He would swallow the injustice, watch Prince Edward face no consequences, and live with the knowledge that institutions valued comfort over courage. But he would keep working, keep his pension, keep his dignity somewhat intact. Marcus sat on that bench for 3 hours, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling the autumn air grow cooler. Tourists came and went, taking their photographs, living their uncomplicated lives. A street musician played guitar nearby, the music drifting across the park. An old man fed pigeons from a paper bag, speaking to the birds in a language Marcus did not recognize. His phone rang, not a text this time, but an actual call. The number was blocked, which usually meant palace administration. Marcus hesitated, then answered. Mr. Chen? A woman's voice, cultured and precise. This is Margaret Thornton, private secretary to Princess Charlotte. Her Royal Highness would like to speak with you if you're available. Not officially, you understand. Just a conversation. Marcus felt his breath catch. When? This evening, if possible. 6 o'clock. There's a private entrance on the east side of the palace, gate 7. The guard there will be expecting you. Please come in civilian clothes, and please keep this meeting confidential. I'll be there, Marcus said. The call ended. Marcus sat holding his phone, trying to process this new development. Princess Charlotte wanted to speak with him privately, outside official channels. It was highly irregular, potentially problematic, and exactly the kind of risk that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. But he had to know what she wanted to say. Marcus went home and changed into simple civilian clothes, dark trousers, and a sweater. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. He looked older than his 32 years, tired in a way that sleep would not fix. He left his apartment at 5:30, taking the underground to avoid traffic. Arriving at gate 7 with 10 minutes to spare, the guard on duty, a young man Marcus recognized but did not know well, checked his identification and waved him through without comment. Marcus followed a palace staffer he did not recognize through corridors he had never walked, up staircases used by family rather than security personnel. They arrived at a small sitting room on the 3rd floor, simply furnished compared to the opulence of public areas. It felt more like someone's personal space, lived in and comfortable. Princess Charlotte entered moments after Marcus arrived. She wore casual clothes, jeans and a simple blouse. Her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Without the formal dress and makeup of public appearances, she looked younger, more approachable, and more genuinely worried. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for Marcus to sit. She sat across from him, not maintaining the formal distance usually required. "I know this is unusual, but I needed to speak with you before you made any decisions about your future."
Your Royal Highness, Marcus began, but Charlotte held up a hand.
"Please, in this room, just Charlotte is fine. We're past formality after what happened." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "I read your report. I gave my statement supporting your actions. But I'm not naive about how the palace works. I know they're pressuring you to accept a reassignment or leave entirely. I know Prince Edward is making threats. And I know none of this is fair to you." "I was doing my job," Marcus said quietly. "You were doing more than your job. You saw something wrong and acted on it when you could have easily looked away. Most people would have looked away." Charlotte's voice carried frustration, anger directed not at Marcus but at the situation. "I've known Edward for years. He's charming at public events, useful for ceremonial duties, connected to powerful families. But in private, he's entitled and inappropriate. What happened last night was not the first time he's made me uncomfortable. It was just the first time someone actually did something about it." Marcus felt a chill. "Has he done this before? To you? To me? To other women at royal events? To staff members who can't risk complaining because they need their jobs? He believes his position makes him untouchable, and until last night, he was essentially correct." Charlotte stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace gardens. "I've complained before, quietly, through proper channels." "Do you know what happened?" "Nothing. I was told to avoid private conversations with him, to ensure others were always present, to manage the situation myself. The institutional response was to make his behavior my problem, to navigate." "That's not right," Marcus said, feeling anger building in his chest. "No, it's not, but it's how these systems work. They protect powerful men and expect everyone else to adapt." Charlotte turned back to face him. "Which is why I can't let you be punished for protecting me. I won't allow it. With respect, I'm not sure you have the power to stop it," Marcus said gently. "The palace administration makes these decisions. They're concerned about public relations, about not offending important families." "Then I'll make my statement public," Charlotte said firmly. "I'll tell the media exactly what happened, exactly how you acted appropriately, and exactly how Edward behaved. I'll force this into the open where they can't quietly manage it away." Marcus stood abruptly. "You can't do that. The scandal would be enormous. It would damage your reputation, the family's reputation. They'd find ways to discredit both of us." "Probably," Charlotte agreed, "but I'm tired of protecting people who don't deserve protection. I'm tired of watching good people punished for doing the right thing, while entitled aristocrats face no consequences. Something has to change. Not like this," Marcus said urgently. "Not by destroying yourself to save me. I'm just a guard. You're a princess with responsibilities, with people who depend on you, with work that matters. Don't throw that away." Charlotte smiled sadly. "You're not just a guard. You're a person who acted with courage when it would have been easier to do nothing. That deserves recognition, not punishment." They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding the impossible position they were in. The palace would pressure Marcus to disappear quietly. If Charlotte made noise, she would be seen as difficult, emotional, unable to handle aristocratic social situations. Marcus would still likely lose his job, and Charlotte would damage her own standing for nothing. "There has to be another way," Marcus said finally. "I'm open to suggestions," Charlotte replied, sitting back down and gesturing for Marcus to do the same. "The palace offered you 3 options, correct? Termination, investigation, or reassignment." "Yes. They want an answer within 24 hours. Charlotte thought for a moment. The reassignment option. What exactly did they propose? They were vague. Something quieter, less visible. Probably a different location entirely, maybe corporate security or embassy work. Somewhere away from the royal family. So they remove you from where you can protect me again, and Edward faces no consequences at all." Charlotte's expression hardened. "Unacceptable. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to accept the reassignment option. But I'm going to specify that you remain in royal protection, specifically as part of my permanent security detail, with a commendation for your actions added to your record." Marcus blinked. "Can you do that?" "I can request it. Whether they agree is another matter. But senior royals do have input into their personal security teams. I'll argue that I trust you, that your actions demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment I want from my guards, and that removing you would compromise my safety, because I'd lose the one person who proved willing to prioritize my well-being over aristocratic politics." "They'll push back," Marcus warned. "This puts them in an awkward position." "Good. Let them be awkward. I'm tired of being the accommodating princess who never makes waves." Charlotte pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'm sending a formal request to Commander Walsh right now. By tomorrow morning, they'll have to respond to both your decision and my requirements. It complicates their neat little solution." Marcus watched her type, feeling a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Why are you doing this?" "You barely know me." Charlotte looked up from her phone. "Because 6 years ago, I watched my mother handle a situation very similar to this one. A staff member saw something wrong, reported it, and was quietly dismissed to avoid embarrassment to powerful people. My mother did nothing. She let it happen because rocking the boat seemed too difficult, too risky. I remember feeling ashamed of her, disappointed that she chose institutional peace over individual justice. I promised myself I would never make that same choice." She finished her message and set down her phone. "Also, you're wrong. I do know you. I've watched you work for years. I've seen how you treat other staff members, how seriously you take your responsibilities, how you manage to be both professional and kind in a place where many people are one or the other, but rarely both. When you stepped into that drawing room last night, I was not surprised. I was relieved that I had read your character correctly. I could still lose my job," Marcus said quietly. "Your support might not be enough. Then we'll deal with that if it happens. But at least we'll have tried. At least you'll know someone fought for you." Charlotte stood, indicating the meeting was ending. "Go home. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. But whatever happens, know that you did nothing wrong. You acted with honor, and that matters more than palace politics." Marcus stood as well. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. I don't know what else to say. Say you'll keep doing what you did last night. Keep being the person who steps in when something is wrong. That's all I ask." The same staffer who had brought Marcus appeared to escort him out. He followed through the palace corridors, his mind racing with new possibilities and new worries. Charlotte's intervention was unexpected and courageous, but it also raised the stakes. Now, if Marcus lost his job, it would reflect badly on Charlotte as well. The palace might decide both of them needed to be managed, controlled, reminded of their places in the hierarchy. He exited through Gate 7 into the London evening. The air had grown cold, and rain threatened from dark clouds gathering overhead. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and began walking, not ready to return to his empty apartment, not ready to stop moving and face the uncertainty of tomorrow. His phone buzzed. A text from James. "Heard Charlotte requested you for her permanent security detail." "Mate, what is happening?" Word traveled fast in the palace. Of course, staff knew already. They always knew everything, the invisible network of people who cleaned and cooked and guarded and served, watching the drama of royalty unfold while maintaining the fiction that they saw nothing. Marcus texted back. "Long story. Tell you tomorrow." Another text came through, this time from an unknown number. Marcus hesitated before opening it. The message was brief and unsigned. You're making this worse for yourself. Accept the reassignment and leave the princess alone. This is your only warning. Marcus stared at the message. It could be from palace administration, from Prince Edward's people, from anyone with a stake in resolving this quietly. The threat was clear even without specifics. Stop fighting, stop complicating things, accept your punishment and disappear. He deleted the message and kept walking. The rain began, light at first, then heavier. Marcus did not seek shelter. The rain felt appropriate, cleansing somehow, washing away the pretense that any of this would be simple or fair. He had stepped across a line last night, and there was no stepping back. Now he had to see where that path led, regardless of consequences. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, he was soaked through. He changed into dry clothes and made tea he did not drink, sitting at his small kitchen table and staring at nothing. His phone rang again. Commander Walsh this time. Chen, we need to meet first thing tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock, same office. Princess Charlotte has submitted a formal request regarding your assignment. This complicates matters significantly. I understand, sir. Do you? Walsh sounded tired, frustrated. You've created a situation where we have to choose between satisfying Prince Edward or accommodating Princess Charlotte. That's not a choice anyone wants to make. Sir, I didn't create this situation. Prince Edward created it when he grabbed Princess Charlotte's wrist. I just responded to it. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Walsh sighed. I know, Chen. Off the record, I know. But on the record, this is a political nightmare. See you tomorrow morning. And Chen? Whatever you think of me after tomorrow, know that I respect what you did. The call ended. Marcus sat in his dark apartment, listening to rain against the windows, wondering how everything had become so complicated. 24 hours ago, he had been a guard doing his job. Now he was at the center of a royal conflict that could define the rest of his career or end it entirely. He tried to sleep, but managed only a few restless hours. By 6 in the morning, he was awake again, drinking coffee and reviewing everything that had happened, preparing mentally for the meeting. He dressed in his uniform, presenting himself as the professional soldier he was trained to be, regardless of what verdict awaited. Marcus arrived at the palace at 7:30. The guards on duty greeted him normally, but he sensed the difference. They knew. Everyone knew. He was no longer just another guard, but a person involved in something larger, something that would be discussed and debated long after the immediate situation resolved. Commander Walsh's office was crowded when Marcus entered at 8 o'clock. Walsh sat behind his desk. The human resources representative was there again, along with the legal counsel. But there were also 2 new people, an older woman in an elegant suit whom Marcus recognized as Lady Catherine Blackwood, the palace's senior advisor on protocol and aristocratic relations, and a younger man in military uniform with medals indicating distinguished service. Sit down, Chen, Walsh said, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested a long night. Marcus sat, maintaining his composure despite his racing heart. Whatever decision had been made, he would accept it with dignity. Lady Catherine spoke first, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had spent decades navigating royal politics. Mr. Chen, you've created quite a situation. Prince Edward Ashford's complaint demands action. His family has significant influence, and dismissing his concerns entirely would create problems we prefer to avoid. However, Princess Charlotte's statement and her subsequent formal request present equally significant considerations. She paused, looking at Marcus with an expression that gave nothing away. We've spent the last 12 hours reviewing this incident from every angle. We've consulted with senior family members, legal advisors, and protocol experts. The consensus is that you acted within the parameters of your responsibilities, albeit in an unconventional manner. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but did not let it show on his face. However, Lady Catherine continued, and the hope dimmed. We cannot simply ignore Prince Edward's complaint. Doing so sets a precedent that guards can intervene in private social situations based on subjective assessments. That's a door we cannot open without significant consequences. The military officer spoke next, his voice clipped and professional. I'm Colonel James Hartley, Head of Royal Security Operations. I've reviewed your service record, Chen. 6 years, spotless conduct, multiple commendations for professionalism. You're exactly the kind of guard we want protecting the royal family, which makes this situation particularly frustrating. Sir, Marcus said, not sure what else to say. Here's what we've decided, Colonel Hartley continued. Prince Edward's complaint will be recorded as a formal protest regarding protocol deviation. You will receive an official reprimand for entering a private gathering without explicit summons. That reprimand will remain in your file permanently. Marcus nodded, accepting the punishment even as it stung. However, Hartley said, and Marcus looked up sharply, you will also receive a commendation for appropriate assessment of a developing situation and effective intervention to ensure royal safety. Princess Charlotte's request to have you assigned to her permanent security detail is granted. You will be promoted to Senior Protection Officer, reporting directly to her head of security. Marcus stared, unable to process what he was hearing. A reprimand and a promotion. A punishment and a reward. It was institutional compromise elevated to an art form, satisfying nobody completely, but giving everyone something. We're calling it a complex situation requiring balanced response, the legal counsel explained. Prince Edward gets his formal complaint acknowledged. Princess Charlotte gets the guard she requested, and you get to keep your career. Everyone moves forward. And Prince Edward? Marcus asked. Does he face any consequences? Lady Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Prince Edward has been counselled regarding appropriate conduct at royal functions. He will not be invited to private palace events for the foreseeable future. His role in ceremonial duties will be reassessed. We're handling this quietly, as is appropriate for family matters. In other words, Marcus thought, Prince Edward would be gently sidelined. His behaviour managed through exclusion rather than confrontation. It was not justice, but it was something. More than he had expected, honestly. Do you accept these terms? Commander Walsh asked. Marcus thought about everything that had happened, everything that could have happened. He had protected Princess Charlotte and kept his career. He was being promoted despite breaking protocol. Prince Edward would face consequences, however mild. It was not perfect, but it was far better than any outcome he had imagined 24 hours ago. Yes, sir, I accept. Good, Walsh said, relief evident in his voice. You'll begin your new assignment next Monday. Report to David Chen, no relation, who heads Princess Charlotte's security detail. He'll brief you on expectations and protocols. And Chen, don't make me regret fighting for this outcome. No, sir. Thank you, sir. The meeting ended. Marcus left the office feeling drained but oddly hopeful. He had survived. More than survived, he had been vindicated, at least partially. The system had bent to accommodate justice, even if it had not broken completely in justice's favour. James found him in the guards' quarters an hour later. You're a legend, mate. The guard who stood up to a prince and got promoted for it. They'll be telling stories about you for years. It wasn't about standing up to him, Marcus said quietly. It was about protecting her. Same thing though, isn't it? When princes think they can do whatever they want, standing up for anyone means standing up to them. James clapped him on the shoulder. I'm proud of you. We all are. Every guard in this palace knows you did the right thing. Over the following days, Marcus began to understand the full extent of what had happened behind the scenes. Charlotte had apparently made her case forcefully, threatening to request a different security service entirely if Marcus was terminated. She had also, according to palace gossip, had a private conversation with senior family members about patterns of inappropriate behaviour at royal events, making it clear that Edward's conduct was not an isolated incident. Prince Edward, meanwhile, had quickly discovered that his complaint had backfired spectacularly. Instead of getting a troublesome guard removed, he had drawn attention to his own behaviour, resulted in his exclusion from future events, and created a situation where multiple people were now watching him closely. His wife Caroline had apparently also found her voice, speaking privately to family members about years of concerning behaviour. The week between the meeting and his new assignment felt surreal to Marcus. He continued his regular duties, but everything had changed. Other guards treated him differently, with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made him uncomfortable. Some saw him as a hero who had stood up to aristocratic entitlement. Others viewed him as someone who had gotten lucky, whose actions could have easily ended in disaster. Marcus tried to maintain normalcy, but normal no longer existed. He was scheduled to protect a princess who had personally requested him, had publicly defended him, and had essentially staked her reputation on his judgment. The weight of that trust pressed heavily on his shoulders. On Friday afternoon, 3 days before his new assignment began, Marcus received a summons to meet with David Chen, head of Princess Charlotte's security detail. They met at a small cafe near the palace, David's choice. He was in his late 40s, with grey streaking through his black hair, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in protective services.
No relation, despite the name,
David said as they sat down, echoing Commander Walsh's earlier comment. My family is from Hong Kong originally. Yours? Singapore. 3 generations back, Marcus replied. Good to know. Makes it slightly less confusing when people are calling for Chen and we both respond. David ordered coffee for both of them, then leaned back and studied Marcus with the assessing gaze of a professional evaluating a new team member.
I'm going to be direct with you because we don't have time for diplomatic dancing.
You've created an extraordinary situation, and now we have to figure out how to make it work. I understand, sir. Do you? Because I'm not sure you fully comprehend what you've signed up for. Princess Charlotte is not like other members of the royal family. She's genuinely committed to her charitable work, she maintains a demanding schedule, and she insists on a level of personal freedom that makes security planning complicated. She pushes boundaries, questions protocols, and generally makes our lives interesting, in ways security professionals prefer to avoid. David's coffee arrived. He added sugar and stirred methodically before continuing. She also has excellent instincts about people, which is why I'm willing to give you a chance despite the chaos you've caused. She sees something in you that she values. My job is to figure out if she's right and, if so, how to integrate you into a team that's been working together for 3 years. What do you need from me? Marcus asked. Honesty, competence, and the same judgment you showed when you stepped into that drawing room. But I also need you to understand the dynamics you're walking into. Charlotte specifically requested you because you prioritized her well-being over aristocratic comfort. That's admirable. It's also a potential problem if you start viewing every uncomfortable social situation as an emergency requiring intervention. Marcus nodded slowly. I understand the concern. I'm not looking to be a hero or to interfere unnecessarily, but I won't ignore genuine problems either. Fair enough. Let me paint you a picture of what protecting Charlotte actually looks like. David pulled out a tablet and brought up a calendar showing the next month's schedule. It was densely packed, color-coded, and looked overwhelming. Charlotte has 37 official engagements in the next 4 weeks. She also has private meetings, charity work, personal time, and family obligations. She likes to walk in public parks, she refuses to use decoy cars, and she insists on shopping in regular stores occasionally, rather than having everything brought to the palace. That sounds like a security nightmare, Marcus observed. It is, but it's also who she is, and our job is to facilitate her life, not restrict it. We assess risks, plan for contingencies, and maintain protective positions without making her feel imprisoned. It's a delicate balance. David swiped through several documents on the tablet. Your predecessor, Michael, retired after 15 years of service. He was excellent. Calm under pressure, great instincts, respected by Charlotte. Those are big shoes to fill. I'll do my best. I know you will. Charlotte wouldn't have requested you otherwise. But here's what you need to understand. Our team works on trust and communication. We have protocols, but we also have to adapt constantly. Charlotte makes spontaneous decisions. She changes plans when she sees opportunities for meaningful interactions. She treats us like people rather than furniture, which is wonderful, but also means she'll ask your opinion on things and expect honest answers. Is that a problem? Marcus asked. Not if you remember that honest doesn't mean unfiltered. Charlotte values directness, but she's also a princess with responsibilities and pressures you can't fully understand. Your job is to protect her physically, but also to understand the context she's operating within. Sometimes that means protecting her from situations she might not initially recognize as problematic. David closed the tablet and looked directly at Marcus, like when she suggested making public statements about Prince Edward. That would have been a disaster for her, even though she was right to be angry. Part of our job is providing perspective when emotions run high. She told you about that? Marcus asked, surprised. She tells me everything relevant to her security and well-being. That's the relationship we've built over 3 years. I'm not just her guard. I'm her advisor on matters of safety and risk. You'll need to develop that same relationship, which takes time and consistent judgment. David finished his coffee. Monday morning, 7 o'clock. We meet at the East Gate. I'll introduce you to the rest of the team, we'll go over protocols and schedules, and we'll discuss how you fit into our protection patterns. Any questions? Just one. Why are you giving me this chance? You could have lobbied against my assignment, argued that I was too controversial, too inexperienced for Charlotte's detail. David smiled slightly. Because Charlotte's instincts are usually correct and because I watched the security footage from that evening. You moved decisively but not aggressively. You created an exit without escalating the situation. You controlled your own emotions while managing everyone else's. Those are the marks of someone who might be very good at this job. I'm willing to find out if I'm right. They parted outside the cafe. Marcus walked back to his apartment, his mind full of new information and new anxieties. Protecting Charlotte would be completely different from his previous assignments. More intimate, more complex, more demanding. He would be part of a small team directly responsible for someone who refused to live within the safe constraints usually afforded to royalty. That weekend, Marcus did something he had never done before. He researched Princess Charlotte extensively, not through official palace materials, which he already knew well, but through news coverage, social media, and public records of her charitable work. He wanted to understand not just the princess he was assigned to protect, but the person behind the title. What he discovered surprised him. Charlotte had completed a degree in international development before taking on full-time royal duties. She had volunteered in refugee camps, worked with domestic violence organizations, and personally visited hospitals and schools without the usual royal fanfare. She gave speeches about mental health, women's rights, and economic inequality that occasionally made palace communication staff nervous because they pushed beyond the usual safe topics royalty addressed. Marcus found interviews where Charlotte spoke candidly about the challenges of royal life, the isolation of being constantly watched, the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when people treated you as a symbol rather than a person. She was intelligent, articulate, and clearly frustrated by the limitations of her role even as she tried to use her position for good. One interview particularly struck Marcus. Charlotte had been asked about the meaning of duty and she had paused before answering. Duty doesn't mean blindly following tradition. Real duty means figuring out how to use your circumstances to make things better for people who don't have your advantages. It means being uncomfortable sometimes, taking risks, speaking up when it would be easier to stay silent. That's the duty I believe in. Marcus understood then why she had fought for him. It was not just about that one evening in the drawing room. It was about the principle that doing the right thing mattered more than maintaining comfortable fictions. Charlotte practiced what she preached, even when it created problems for herself. Monday morning arrived with grey skies and cold wind. Marcus dressed in the civilian clothes appropriate for close protection work. Dark suit, comfortable shoes, earpiece barely visible. He arrived at the East Gate at 6:30, wanting to be early, wanting to prove his reliability. David was already there with 2 other team members. Marcus Chen, meet your new colleagues. This is Sarah Martinez, been with us for 2 years. She handles advanced work and threat assessment. Sarah was in her 30s, athletic build, sharp eyes that catalogued everything. She shook Marcus's hand with a firm grip. And this is Tom Okafor, our communications specialist and tech expert. He makes sure all our equipment works and maintains our secure networks. Tom was younger, maybe late 20s, with an easy smile and the slightly rumpled look of someone more comfortable with computers than people. Welcome to the team, Sarah said. David tells us you're the reason we've all been subjected to new harassment and inappropriate behavior training modules.
Marcus winced.
Sorry about that. Don't be. That training was long overdue. We all know what happened and we all agree you did the right thing. Just don't make a habit of creating international incidents, yeah? Sarah's tone was friendly, taking the sting out of her words. I'll do my best to keep things boring, Marcus promised. David led them inside to a small office that served as the security team's base of operations. The walls were covered with schedules, maps, and photographs of venues Charlotte would visit. Multiple monitors showed security camera feeds from various locations around the palace. A large table held tablets, radios, and other equipment. Let's talk about how we work, David began, pulling up our organizational chart on one of the monitors. I coordinate overall security and serve as primary close protection officer. Sarah does advance work, visiting locations before Charlotte arrives, assessing threats, establishing security protocols.
Tom handles all our technology, maintains our communication systems, and monitors digital threats.
You'll be working as secondary close protection, which means you're with Charlotte during events, backing me up, watching for things I might miss. He pulled up a video of a recent event, showing Charlotte visiting a community center. Marcus watched how the security team moved, noting their positions, their sightlines, how they balanced visibility and discretion. David stood close to Charlotte but slightly behind, his eyes constantly scanning. Sarah was positioned near the entrance, watching people entering and leaving. Tom was not visible in the footage, but David explained he was monitoring from a mobile command vehicle, watching camera feeds and maintaining communication with local police. Notice how we're always creating overlapping fields of vision, David explained. If I'm focused on Charlotte and the person she's talking to, Sarah is watching the crowd. If Sarah is checking credentials of someone trying to approach, I've shifted to cover what she was watching. We work as a system, not as individuals. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing protocols, communication codes, emergency procedures, and evacuation routes from dozens of locations. Marcus's head swam with information, but he focused intensely, knowing that any gap in his knowledge could create vulnerabilities. Charlotte has a public engagement this afternoon, David said, checking his watch. Garden opening at a children's hospital. Relatively low-risk environment, controlled guest list, good opportunity for you to observe how we work before you take a more active role. You'll shadow me. Watch how we position ourselves. See how Charlotte interacts with people. At 2 o'clock, they assembled in the palace courtyard, where cars waited. Charlotte emerged wearing a bright blue coat, practical shoes, her hair styled formally but not stiffly. She greeted each security team member by name, including Marcus. Officer Chen, good to see you officially starting. David's been telling me you're doing well in your orientation. Thank you, Your Royal Highness. I'm grateful for the opportunity. You earned it. Today is fairly straightforward. Children, families, hospital staff. Should be a pleasant afternoon. She climbed into the car, David getting in beside her while Marcus joined Sarah in the follow vehicle. The hospital was in East London, a modern facility with a new healing garden being dedicated in honor of a major donor. Security had established a perimeter, local police were visible at access points, and guests were already assembled when Charlotte's car arrived. David and Sarah moved into position immediately, and Marcus followed David's lead, staying close but not intrusive as Charlotte began greeting people. Marcus watched how she worked. Charlotte had a gift for making people feel seen, bending down to speak with children at their eye level, taking time with each person rather than rushing through obligatory handshakes. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers, laughed genuinely at children's jokes, and showed real interest in the hospital's work. But Marcus also watched the crowd. Most people were exactly what they appeared to be: families, staff, donors genuinely there to support the hospital. But security work meant watching for the exceptions: the man who seemed more interested in photographing Charlotte than the event, the woman who kept trying to get closer despite staff attempts to maintain the receiving line, the teenager whose body language suggested agitation rather than excitement. David handled each potential issue smoothly. A quiet word to staff about the photographer, who turned out to be a legitimate journalist who had forgotten his credentials badge. A gentle redirection of the persistent woman, who was simply eager to thank Charlotte for past support. A brief conversation with the agitated teenager, who was nervous about meeting royalty but had a gift to present. Marcus began to understand what David had meant about judgment and context. Security was not just about identifying threats, but about distinguishing between genuine problems and ordinary human behavior that looked concerning without being dangerous. It required constant assessment, understanding social dynamics, reading situations accurately. The event lasted 2 hours. By the end, Charlotte had spoken with everyone present, dedicated the garden, posed for official photographs, and left families feeling appreciated and heard. As they returned to the cars, she looked tired but satisfied. "Well done today," Charlotte said to her security team before getting in the car. "Smooth operation, no issues. Thank you." Back at the palace, David gathered the team for a debriefing. It was standard procedure after every event, reviewing what had worked and what could be improved. "Thoughts, Marcus?" David asked. "First time observing our operation. What did you notice?" Marcus considered carefully. "You maintained excellent sight lines and communication throughout. Sarah's advance work clearly paid off. The layout was optimized for both Charlotte's interactions and our security positions. Tom's real-time updates about the photographer issue let you address it before it became a problem. The whole system worked smoothly." "What could we have done better?" Sarah asked. "The entrance had a brief bottleneck when the event ended and guests were leaving while you were moving Charlotte to the car. It was probably fine, but there was a moment when too many people were in the same space and our lines of sight were partially blocked." David nodded approvingly. "Good catch. We got a bit complacent because the event had gone well. That's exactly the kind of observation we need. Sarah, let's add exit protocols to our advanced planning checklist, making sure we coordinate guest departure with principal movement." They reviewed the rest of the event, discussing communications, equipment, interactions with local police, and logistics. It was professional, thorough, and Marcus appreciated the team's willingness to analyze their own performance critically. Over the following weeks, Marcus settled into his new role. He shadowed David at events, gradually taking more active responsibility as he learned the team's rhythms and procedures. Charlotte had an exhausting schedule: public engagements, private meetings, charity work, family obligations. Marcus learned to function on minimal sleep, to stay alert during long periods of waiting, to assess risks constantly without becoming paranoid. He also learned about Charlotte as a person. She was kind to staff but demanded excellence. She appreciated humor but had no patience for incompetence. She made decisions quickly but thoughtfully. She pushed boundaries carefully, testing limits without being reckless. She was more intelligent than many people gave her credit for, more strategic in her charitable work than public perception suggested. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into his new assignment, Marcus was with Charlotte during a private visit to a domestic violence shelter. These private visits happen regularly, without media coverage, allowing Charlotte to meet with people without the pressure of public attention. David had been called away to deal with a family emergency, making Marcus the primary protection officer for the day. The shelter was in North London, run by a non-profit organisation Charlotte had supported for years. Security had been arranged in advance, but the environment was inherently unpredictable. The residents were trauma survivors, dealing with complex situations, and Marcus had to balance security with sensitivity to their circumstances. Charlotte spent 2 hours meeting with residents and staff, listening to stories, discussing the organisation's needs, and offering support. Marcus maintained his position near her, aware but not intrusive, giving people space to interact with Charlotte while staying ready to respond if necessary. Near the end of the visit, a situation developed. One of the residents, a woman named Amina, with 2 young children, became emotional while talking with Charlotte about her experience leaving an abusive relationship. The conversation was intense, raw, and genuine. Marcus noticed a man approaching from a side corridor, moving quickly, his expression agitated. Marcus moved smoothly between the man and Charlotte, positioning himself to intercept without appearing threatening. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop there. This is a private meeting." The man stopped, anger flashing across his face. "That's my wife. Those are my kids. I have a right to see them." The shelter director appeared immediately, her face pale. "Marcus, this is Daniel Amina's ex-partner. He has a restraining order and should not be here." Marcus heard Charlotte behind him, calmly telling Amina and her children to step into an office with a staff member. He kept his attention on Daniel, assessing the threat. The man was not visibly armed, but he was larger than Marcus, agitated, and clearly capable of violence. "Daniel, you need to leave now," Marcus said calmly. "You're violating a court order by being here. If you leave peacefully, we can all avoid escalating this situation." "I just want to see my family," Daniel said, but his hands were clenched into fists, his body language radiating barely controlled aggression. "I understand you're upset, but this is not the way to handle it. There are legal processes for these situations. Right now, you need to turn around and leave before police arrive." Marcus had already signaled Tom through his earpiece to call local police, but he needed to manage the situation until they arrived. "Who are you to tell me anything? You're just some security guard. This is none of your business. Actually, ensuring everyone's safety here is exactly my business. And right now, your presence is threatening people's safety." Marcus maintained his position, blocking Daniel's access to the rest of the shelter while giving him a clear path to the exit. The tension stretched. Marcus could hear sirens in the distance, police responding to Tom's call. Daniel heard them too, and something in his expression changed. Calculation replacing anger. He knew he was out of time. "This isn't over," Daniel said, but he turned and walked toward the exit. Marcus followed at a distance, ensuring he actually left the building. Police arrived moments later, and Marcus briefed them on what had happened. They confirmed that Daniel had indeed violated his restraining order and left to locate him. Marcus returned inside to find Charlotte with Amina, both of them visibly shaken but safe. The shelter director was apologizing profusely, explaining that they had security protocols, but Daniel had somehow bypassed them. "It's not your fault," Charlotte said firmly. "What matters is that everyone is safe now." Marcus handled it perfectly. Later in the car returning to the palace, Charlotte was quiet for several minutes before speaking.
"That could have gone very badly. If Daniel had been armed, if he'd been more aggressive, if you hadn't been paying attention. But those things didn't happen," Marcus said gently.
"We prepared for contingencies, we responded appropriately, and everyone went home safe. That's how security is supposed to work."
Is it always like this?
Waiting for situations that might develop into crises, managing threats that could emerge at any moment? Part of it, yes. But most days, nothing happens. Most people are good people, and most situations resolve peacefully. We prepare for the exceptions so we can handle them when they occur. Charlotte looked at him thoughtfully. "That's why you stepped in with Edward, isn't it? Not because you thought he was necessarily dangerous, but because you recognized the pattern of a situation that could become a problem if not addressed. Something like that. Experience teaches you to read situations, to recognize when people's boundaries are being violated, when someone's comfort is becoming someone else's distress. Edward might not have physically harmed you, but his behavior was problematic and escalating. It needed to be stopped. "I'm glad you're on my security team," Charlotte said simply. "I trust your judgment." Those words carried weight that Marcus felt deeply. Trust from the person you were assigned to protect was essential. Without it, the relationship became adversarial, security measures became restrictions, and everyone's job became harder. With it, protection could be effective while still allowing the principal to live a meaningful life. When David returned the next day, Marcus briefed him on the incident at the shelter. David listened carefully, asked detailed questions about how Marcus had assessed and managed the situation, and then nodded approvingly. "You handled that exactly right. Protected Charlotte without escalating unnecessarily, gave the aggressor a way out, coordinated with local police appropriately. That's textbook close protection work."
How did Charlotte react?
She was shaken but grateful. We talked afterward about how security actually works, the constant assessment and preparation.
Good.
She needs to understand that. Part of our job is helping her see the security perspective without making her paranoid. It's a balance. David pulled up their schedule for the coming weeks. "You're ready to take primary protection on some events. Start with lower risk engagements, but I trust you to handle them." Marcus felt both pride and anxiety at the responsibility. Primary protection meant being directly responsible for Charlotte's safety, making real-time decisions, coordinating the security operation. It was what he had trained for, but the weight of actual responsibility felt different from preparation. His first event as primary protection officer was a university speaking engagement. Charlotte was delivering a lecture on international development to a packed auditorium. Sarah had done extensive advance work, securing the venue, establishing access controls, coordinating with university security. Tom monitored communications and camera feeds. Marcus stood near the stage, watching the audience, trusting his team to handle the elements they were responsible for, while he focused on immediate threats. The lecture went perfectly. Charlotte was engaging and knowledgeable, the audience was respectful and attentive, and nothing concerning happened. But the flawless execution was the result of hours of preparation, constant vigilance, and a team working in perfect coordination. Security was like theater. When done well, the audience never noticed the complexity behind the smooth performance. As weeks became months, Marcus found his rhythm. He understood Charlotte's patterns, anticipated her needs, recognized when situations required intervention and when they could develop naturally. He developed working relationships with palace staff, venue security teams, and local police forces. He learned to balance protection with freedom, safety with spontaneity. But he also began to understand the deeper complexities of royal life. The constant public scrutiny, the pressure to maintain appearances, the impossibility of genuine privacy. Charlotte could never have a bad day publicly, never show frustration or exhaustion in ways normal people could. She had to be perpetually gracious, constantly professional, endlessly patient with people who felt entitled to her time and attention. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of back-to-back engagements, Charlotte asked Marcus to walk with her through the palace gardens. It was unusual but not unprecedented. She occasionally needed to decompress after intense schedules, and walking helped her process the day. "Do you ever regret becoming a security officer?" Charlotte asked, as they walked through carefully maintained flower beds under a darkening sky. "Sometimes," Marcus admitted. "The hours are difficult, the pressure is constant, and the hypervigilance becomes exhausting. But when I watch you interact with people, see the genuine good your work accomplishes, I remember why the job matters. Protecting someone doing meaningful work feels worthwhile." Even after everything that happened with Edward? The reprimand, the controversy, the questioning of your judgment? Especially after that. Because that situation proved that doing the right thing sometimes costs something, but the cost of not doing it is worse. I'd rather have a reprimand in my file than know I stood by and watched someone be harassed because intervening was inconvenient. Charlotte stopped walking and turned to face him. "I worry sometimes that I ask too much of my security team, but I put you in difficult positions by refusing to live within normal royal constraints. Other family members are content to maintain distance, to interact with the world through carefully controlled appearances. I keep pushing for more direct engagement, more authentic interactions, and that creates security challenges." "It does," Marcus agreed. "But authentic engagement is also where you do your best work. The private visits to shelters and hospitals, the conversations with people affected by the issues you work on, that's where real change happens. Our job is to make that possible safely, not to prevent it entirely. Thank you for understanding that. Not everyone does." Some people think I should accept that my role is purely ceremonial. The genuine social impact is beyond what royalty can accomplish. But I believe we have platforms that can be used for good, if we're willing to take risks and have difficult conversations. They walked in silence for a while, the evening air cool and quiet. Marcus thought about how much his life had changed since that dinner 4 months ago, when he stepped into the drawing room and changed the trajectory of his career. He had been prepared to lose everything for doing what he believed was right. Instead, he had found work that felt more meaningful than anything he had done before, protecting someone who was genuinely trying to make the world better. Charlotte, Marcus said, using her first name as she had invited her security team to do in private moments. For what it's worth, I think you're doing important work, and I'm honored to be part of making it possible. She smiled, the tired but genuine smile of someone who rarely heard uncomplicated affirmation.
Thank you, Marcus.
That means more than you know. They returned to the palace as stars began appearing in the London sky, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. Knowing that the real work of royalty happened not in grand ceremonies, but in small moments of genuine human connection, protected by people who understood that some things were worth the risk. 6 months after the incident with Prince Edward, Marcus had fully integrated into Charlotte's security team. The rhythm of royal protection had become second nature. The early mornings, the constant vigilance, the balance between visibility and discretion. He had developed the ability to stand for hours without apparent fatigue, to assess crowds instantaneously, to anticipate Charlotte's movements before she made them. The work was demanding but fulfilling in ways he had not expected. What Marcus had not anticipated was how visible he would become. The story of the guard who intervened during a private royal dinner had leaked despite palace efforts to contain it. British tabloids, always hungry for royal drama, had pieced together the basic facts through unnamed sources and careful investigation. Headlines appeared. Royal Guard faces down Prince in protection of Princess. The man who said no to royalty. Security officer's brave stand earns promotion. Most stories got the details wrong, adding drama that had not existed, creating conflicts that were more fiction than fact. But the core narrative resonated with public imagination. An ordinary person standing up to power, consequences be damned. Marcus found himself recognized occasionally on the street, pointed at by tourists, approached by people wanting to shake his hand or thank him for doing the right thing. He hated every moment of the attention. Royal guards were supposed to be invisible, professional shadows who never became the story themselves. His face in newspapers felt like a failure of discretion, a breach of the fundamental principle that protection officers should fade into the background. David reassured him that the attention would fade, that the public had short memories for stories that did not offer continuous drama. But the recognition still made Marcus uncomfortable. The attention also created unexpected professional complications. Other members of the royal family began requesting information about Marcus, wanting to know if this guard who had challenged Prince Edward might be similarly willing to challenge their own behavior. Some viewed him with suspicion, others with curiosity. The Palace Communications Office began coordinating with Charlotte's security team before events, ensuring Marcus would not be positioned where photographers could easily capture him, trying to minimize his visibility in official photos. Charlotte found the entire situation frustrating. You did your job correctly, and now you're being treated like a curiosity. It's absurd. The story should be about Edward's inappropriate behavior, not about your response to it. They were in the car traveling to an event at a Children's Literacy Foundation, one of Charlotte's personal projects. Sarah was driving, Tom monitoring communications from the passenger seat, Marcus and Charlotte in the back, with David in a follow vehicle coordinating with local security. The story is easier to tell with a hero and a villain, Marcus said. I happen to be cast as the hero, Edward, as the villain. It's reductive and not entirely accurate, but it's the narrative people can understand easily. You don't see yourself as a hero? Charlotte asked. I see myself as someone who did his job in a specific situation. Nothing more complicated than that. Heroes make grand sacrifices for noble causes. I just stopped an uncomfortable interaction at a dinner party. An uncomfortable interaction that many people would have ignored because addressing it created professional risk. That's precisely why people view it as heroic. Not because the action itself was extraordinary, but because most people in your position would have chosen safety over principle. Marcus considered this. The conversation was becoming more philosophical than he was comfortable with, but Charlotte seemed genuinely interested in his perspective. Maybe heroism is just doing the obvious thing when the obvious thing is difficult. In that moment, stepping in was obvious to me. The difficulty came afterward. And you'd do it again knowing the difficulty it would cause? Without question. Charlotte smiled. That's what makes it heroic, Marcus. You chose correctly even knowing the cost. Most people can't say the same. They arrived at the Literacy Foundation, a converted warehouse in East London now filled with books, computers, and learning spaces for children from underprivileged backgrounds. Charlotte had been involved with the organization for years, helping secure funding, volunteering as a reading tutor, and using her platform to draw attention to literacy issues. The event was a celebration of the Foundation's 10th anniversary, with dozens of children, families, staff, and donors present. Security was straightforward: vetted guest list, controlled environment, low threat assessment. Marcus had reviewed the plans with Sarah, walked through the venue that morning, and felt confident about the arrangements. What Marcus had not planned for was the presence of Martin Fletcher, a member of Parliament known for his controversial positions and his willingness to create confrontation for political gain. Fletcher was not on the original guest list, but had been added at the last minute as a courtesy because he represented the local district. David had mentioned it during the morning briefing, noting that Fletcher was unpredictable but usually harmless at public events. The celebration began smoothly. Charlotte moved through the crowd, speaking with children about their favorite books, thanking volunteers and acknowledging donors. Fletcher remained near the back of the room, speaking with Foundation staff, seemingly content to observe rather than participate. Then Charlotte gave a short speech about the importance of literacy and education as pathways to opportunity. It was heartfelt and personal, drawing on her own experiences visiting schools and meeting children struggling to read. She spoke about systemic barriers that prevented some children from accessing quality education, about the responsibility society had to ensure all children could develop their potential regardless of economic circumstances. Fletcher chose that moment to interject. He stood and spoke loudly enough to interrupt Charlotte mid-sentence. With respect, Your Royal Highness, this narrative about systemic barriers is precisely what creates dependency and victimhood. What children need is personal responsibility and work ethic, not excuses about circumstances. The room fell silent. Charlotte paused, clearly surprised by the interruption but recovering quickly. I appreciate your perspective, Mr. Fletcher, but I disagree. Personal responsibility matters, certainly, but it's difficult to exercise responsibility when you lack basic resources and opportunities. And that's exactly the kind of privileged viewpoint that perpetuates these problems, Fletcher continued, warming to his confrontation.
You've never experienced genuine hardship, never had to struggle for anything.
Perhaps you should spend less time telling us what children need and more time acknowledging your own limitations in understanding their reality. Marcus moved slightly closer to Charlotte, positioning himself between her and Fletcher while trying to appear non-threatening. David had also shifted position, both of them recognizing that Fletcher was creating a situation that required management. Charlotte's expression had tightened, but she maintained her composure. You're absolutely correct that I've lived a life of extraordinary privilege, Charlotte said calmly, which is precisely why I spend my time listening to people who have experienced hardship I cannot personally understand. The children and families I work with have taught me far more than I could ever teach them. But my privilege doesn't invalidate the observable reality that systemic barriers exist and that addressing them requires collective effort. Collective effort funded by taxpayers to support your charitable vanity projects, Fletcher shot back. Meanwhile, the rest of us actually work for living and watch resources diverted to programs that create dependency.
Marcus saw Charlotte's jaw tighten.
Fletcher was being deliberately provocative, trying to bait her into an emotional response that would play well in media coverage. Charlotte understood this. She had dealt with provocateurs before, but understanding the tactic did not make it less frustrating. Before Charlotte could respond, one of the Foundation's directors stepped forward, attempting to redirect the conversation. Perhaps we could discuss policy questions at a more appropriate time. This is a celebration for the children who have benefited from our programs. Of course, Fletcher said with false courtesy. I wouldn't want to spoil the princess's photo opportunity with uncomfortable questions about effectiveness and accountability. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily. Fletcher was being deliberately disrespectful, trying to provoke a reaction from either Charlotte or her security team, creating drama that would generate headlines and raise his political profile. Marcus forced himself to remain still, to not provide the confrontation Fletcher wanted. Charlotte took a breath and smiled with cold politeness. Thank you for your input, Mr. Fletcher. I'm always interested in diverse perspectives, even ones delivered discourteously. Now, if you'll excuse me, I came here to celebrate these children's achievements, which is far more important than engaging with political theatre. she turned away from Fletcher, effectively dismissing him, and resumed speaking with the children who had gathered around. It was a masterful de-escalation, acknowledging Fletcher's existence just enough to avoid appearing dismissive while refusing to engage with his provocations. The audience, mostly families and Foundation staff, applauded Charlotte's response, making clear whose behavior they approved of. Fletcher remained in the room for another 20 minutes, taking photographs of himself with uncomfortable-looking Foundation staff, clearly trying to create social media content that would portray him as the reasonable one confronting royal excess. Marcus watched him carefully, ensuring he did not approach Charlotte again, ready to intervene if Fletcher escalated beyond verbal confrontation. When Fletcher finally left, the atmosphere in the room relaxed noticeably. Charlotte continued her conversations with children and families, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile had become slightly forced. The confrontation had rattled her, even though she had handled it perfectly. In the car returning to the palace, Charlotte was uncharacteristically quiet. Marcus and David exchanged glances, both recognizing that she was processing something difficult. Finally, Charlotte spoke, her voice tight with controlled anger. That was calculated to undermine me in front of children and families I genuinely care about. Fletcher knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to create a moment that would make me look elitist and out of touch, that would reduce years of genuine work to charitable vanity projects. And I let him do it. You didn't let him do anything, David said firmly. You responded with dignity and refused to engage with his provocations. Everyone in that room saw who was being respectful and who was creating unnecessary confrontation. But that's not how it will be reported. The headlines will be Princess confronted by MP about charity effectiveness or Royal project questioned by local representative. My response won't matter because the mere fact that the confrontation happened creates doubt about my work. Marcus leaned forward slightly. With respect, Your Royal Highness, I think you're underestimating people's ability to recognize manipulation. Fletcher was transparently trying to create drama. You maintained your composure and redirected attention to the children you came to celebrate. That's what people will remember. Will they? Or will they remember the MP who dared to question the princess who spoke uncomfortable truths that no one else would say? Charlotte rubbed her temples, exhaustion showing through her usually controlled demeanor. I'm so tired of this. Every event, every speech, every public appearance is an opportunity for someone to try to score political points or generate controversy. I can't just do good work. I have to constantly defend the legitimacy of that work while maintaining perfect composure and never showing frustration. The car fell silent. Sarah was navigating through London traffic, Tom was monitoring communications, but both were listening. These were the moments when Charlotte's carefully maintained public image cracked slightly, revealing the human being beneath the royal title. The pressure she carried constantly, the impossibility of meeting everyone's expectations, the loneliness of being perpetually scrutinized.
You're allowed to be frustrated, Marcus said quietly.
You're allowed to be angry that someone ambushed you at a children's literacy event. You're allowed to be exhausted by constantly having to justify work that clearly benefits people. You don't have to be perfectly composed every moment. Yes, I do, Charlotte said flatly. That's the job. I represent the monarchy, which means I represent stability, continuity, and dignity. If I lose my composure publicly, if I show anger or frustration, I'm failing my responsibilities. Personal feelings are a luxury I don't have. In public, perhaps, but right now, in this car with your security team, you can be human. We're not going to judge you for having emotions. We're here to protect you. And part of that is understanding that you're dealing with pressures most people can't imagine. Charlotte looked at Marcus, something softening in her expression. Thank you. I don't often have spaces where I can acknowledge how difficult this is. Most people either see only the privilege and can't understand the pressure, or they expect me to represent some idealized version of royalty that doesn't actually exist. David spoke up from his seat. We see the work you do, the genuine care you bring to your responsibilities. We also see the toll it takes. That's why we're here, not just to protect you from physical threats, but to create space where you can do your work without constantly defending yourself. The conversation shifted to logistics for upcoming events, but something had changed. Marcus realized that his role was more complex than he had initially understood. Protecting Charlotte was not just about managing physical security. It was about understanding the psychological pressures she faced, the emotional labor of maintaining her public role, the exhaustion of being constantly performing for an audience that rarely saw her as a full person. Over the following weeks, Marcus began noticing patterns he had previously missed. How Charlotte's shoulders would tense when approaching events where hostile media might be present. How her smile would become more fixed when interacting with certain aristocrats who viewed her charitable work as inappropriate for royalty. How she would decompress after difficult events, by asking her security team about their lives, their families, anything that reminded her that normal human existence continued outside her royal bubble. Marcus also noticed how the incident with Fletcher had been reported exactly as Charlotte predicted. Headlines focused on Royal Project questioned and MP challenges Princess on charity effectiveness. Fletcher had given interviews painting himself as the brave representative willing to ask difficult questions about royal spending. Charlotte's actual response, her dignity and focus on the children, was mentioned only briefly, if at all. One evening, about 2 weeks after the Fletcher incident, Marcus was on night duty at the palace. Late shifts were usually quiet. Charlotte in her private quarters, minimal staff present, nothing happening except routine patrol and monitoring. Marcus was walking through one of the palace corridors when he noticed light coming from beneath the door of Charlotte's private study. It was past midnight. Charlotte should have been asleep, preparing for an early morning engagement. Marcus hesitated, then knocked gently on the door. "Come in," Charlotte's voice called out. Marcus entered to find Charlotte at her desk, surrounded by papers and her laptop, open to what appeared to be research articles. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, still wearing the casual clothes she had changed into hours earlier. "Your Royal Highness, is everything all right?" "It's quite late." Charlotte gestured to the papers. "I'm preparing for a speech next week about education policy. Fletcher's comments made me realize I need to be more rigorous in citing research, more aggressive in documenting the effectiveness of the programs I support. If people are going to question my work, I need to be unassailable in my facts." Marcus looked at the stack of papers. Academic journals, program evaluations, statistical analyses. Charlotte was doing graduate-level research in the middle of the night, trying to armor herself against critics with credentials and data. "You don't need to do this right now," Marcus said gently. "It's late, you have commitments tomorrow, and you're clearly exhausted. I need to be prepared. I need to be beyond criticism. That means doing the work others won't expect me to do, knowing the research they assume I haven't read, being more knowledgeable than the so-called experts who dismiss me because of my title." Marcus sat down across from her desk, a breach of protocol but feeling necessary. "Charlotte, you already do more than anyone could reasonably expect. You visit dozens of organizations, meet hundreds of people, raise significant funding for important causes. You don't have to be a policy expert too. That's not a reasonable expectation, but it's the expectation people have. If I'm going to use my platform to advocate for change, I have to be credible. And credibility means knowing the data, understanding the research, being able to defend my positions against any attack." Charlotte's voice carried a desperation Marcus had not heard before. "I can't just be a ceremonial figure who shows up for photo opportunities. I have to actually know what I'm talking about. Have to be taken seriously as something more than a pretty face with a title." "You are taken seriously. The Foundation staff respect your work. The families you help appreciate your genuine engagement. The only people questioning your credibility are those trying to score political points. And those people have platforms too. They have media attention. Their skepticism matters because it shapes public perception." Charlotte closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. "Do you know what the hardest part is? Not knowing if I'm actually making a difference or just performing charity for public consumption. Maybe Fletcher is right. Maybe I'm just a privileged person playing at helping while accomplishing nothing meaningful." Marcus felt a surge of frustration at Fletcher and everyone like him who made dedicated people doubt the value of their work. "You are making a difference. I've watched you interact with children who light up when you remember their names and ask about their progress. I've seen families grateful for programs you helped fund. I've heard staff describe how your involvement brings attention and resources to organizations that desperately need both. That's not performative charity. That's genuine impact. Or it's just making myself feel better while systemic problems continue unchanged." "Charlotte, systemic problems are complex and don't have simple solutions. But that doesn't mean individual effort is meaningless. You're using your privilege and platform to amplify voices that often go unheard, to direct resources to underfunded programs, to demonstrate that people in power should care about these issues. That matters, even if it doesn't solve everything immediately." Charlotte rubbed her eyes, exhaustion evident. "I want to believe that. I need to believe that. But nights like this, when I'm surrounded by research trying to justify my existence, I wonder if I'm fooling myself." "You're not. And you need sleep more than you need more research right now. The speech will be fine. You know your material, you understand the issues, and you genuinely care. That authenticity is more valuable than any amount of statistical citation. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, then smiled slightly. When did my security officer become my life coach? Part of the protection services package. We guide your physical safety and occasionally your mental health when you're clearly running yourself into the ground. She laughed, genuine amusement breaking through the exhaustion. All right, I'll go to bed. But Marcus, thank you for reminding me why I do this work, even when it feels impossible. Marcus stood. That's what I'm here for, Your Royal Highness.
Well, that and stopping aggressive aristocrats at dinner parties. Charlotte stood as well, gathering her papers.
You're never going to let me forget that evening, are you? It's literally in my job description now. Protect Princess from uncomfortable social situations.
I take my responsibilities seriously. She walked toward the door, pausing to turn back. I'm glad you're on my team, Marcus. Not just because you're good at your job, but because you see me as a person rather than just a title to protect. That means more than you know. After Charlotte left, Marcus continued his patrol, thinking about the conversation. He had glimpsed the private struggle beneath Charlotte's public confidence, the doubt and exhaustion that drove her to work impossibly hard, the pressure to justify her existence in ways most people never faced. It made him more determined to protect not just her physical safety, but also the space she needed to do work she found meaningful. The next morning's schedule included 3 engagements, a hospital visit, a meeting with education ministers, and an evening reception for an environmental charity. Marcus met with David to coordinate security for each event. They were reviewing the hospital protocols when David looked at Marcus thoughtfully. Charlotte seemed more relaxed this morning. Less tense than she's been since the Fletcher incident. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Marcus kept his expression neutral. I may have encountered Her Royal Highness working late last night and suggested she needed rest more than additional research. David smiled slightly. Good. That's part of our job too, recognizing when she's pushing too hard and providing gentle course correction. Charlotte trusts very few people enough to show vulnerability. The fact that she's comfortable doing that with you means you're exactly where you need to be. The hospital visit went smoothly, Charlotte's exhaustion from the previous night not visible in her public demeanor. She moved through the pediatric ward with genuine warmth, sitting with sick children, bringing moments of joy to families facing difficult circumstances. Marcus watched her work, marveling at her ability to compartmentalize personal struggle and focus entirely on the people she was serving. During the meeting with education ministers, Charlotte delivered a presentation on literacy programs with confidence and clarity, citing research but also bringing personal stories that made the data meaningful. Marcus stood outside the conference room, but he could hear through the slightly open door as Charlotte made her case for increased funding and policy changes. She was articulate, prepared, and persuasive. Fletcher would have struggled to challenge her in this setting where substance mattered more than sound bites. The evening reception was at a historic London venue, with several hundred guests from environmental organizations, corporate sponsors, and political figures. Security was complex. Multiple entry points, large crowd, diverse guest list that included activists who sometimes clashed with corporate representatives. Sarah had done extensive advance work, but the environment required constant vigilance. Marcus was positioned near Charlotte as she worked the room, making conversation with donors and activists alike. He noticed tension between some guests, environmental activists eyeing corporate sponsors with suspicion, politicians trying to network without appearing opportunistic, competing organizations vying for Charlotte's attention and potential support. About halfway through the event, Marcus noticed a man approaching Charlotte with determined body language that suggested someone on a mission. Marcus moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. The man was in his early 30s, wearing a suit but with the slightly disheveled appearance of someone more comfortable in casual clothes. He carried a folder of papers and had a press credential hanging around his neck. Your Royal Highness, the man said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby guests. I'm Peter Whitmore with the Daily Sentinel. I'd like to ask you about the environmental impact of the royal family's personal travel habits. How do you reconcile promoting environmental causes while maintaining a significant carbon footprint through private planes and multiple residences? Marcus recognized the tactic immediately, a hostile question designed to create an uncomfortable moment, probably being recorded on a hidden device for publication. Charlotte's expression tightened slightly, but she responded with practiced diplomacy. That's a fair question. The royal family has been working to reduce our environmental impact through various initiatives. Transitioning to renewable energy in our properties, offsetting carbon from necessary travel, supporting conservation efforts. But you're right that there's an inherent tension between promoting environmental causes and maintaining the requirements of royal duties. That's why personal action has to be paired with advocacy for systemic change. So you admit to hypocrisy? Whitmore pressed, sensing vulnerability. I admit to being part of a system that has environmental costs, yes. Which is precisely why I work to change that system and support others doing the same work. Perfect consistency is impossible, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for improvement. Marcus could see other guests were watching now, the conversation drawing attention. Whitmore was creating his controversy, getting his confrontational moment with royalty. Charlotte maintained her composure, but Marcus saw the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated stress. Marcus, Charlotte said quietly, looking directly at him, I believe I have another engagement that requires my attention. It was a clear request for extraction, using Marcus as an excuse to exit the confrontation. Marcus stepped forward smoothly. My apologies, Your Royal Highness, but you do need to make your other commitment. We're already running slightly behind schedule. It was a complete fabrication. Charlotte had no other engagement, but it provided a face-saving exit from the hostile questioning. Charlotte made polite excuses to the guests around her and moved toward the exit, Marcus accompanying her while David coordinated their departure. In the car, Charlotte was silent for several minutes before exploding. I'm so sick of this. I can't attend a charity event without someone trying to ambush me with gotcha questions. I can't promote causes I care about without being called a hypocrite. What do they want from me? Should I stop advocating for anything because my circumstances aren't perfect? Should I only support causes where I can personally embody every principle? David and Marcus exchanged glances. This was the frustration Charlotte usually controlled, the anger at constantly being put on trial for trying to do good work in an imperfect system. They want you to fail, Marcus said quietly. People like Whitmore and Fletcher don't actually care about environmental policy or charity effectiveness. They care about bringing down someone they perceive as privileged. Your efforts to do meaningful work make them uncomfortable because it challenges their narrative that royalty is purely parasitic. So they attack, trying to find contradiction or hypocrisy, anything that lets them dismiss your work without engaging with its substance. Then, what's the point? Why work so hard if people are determined to find fault no matter what I do? Because the work matters regardless of whether everyone appreciates it. The children learning to read because of programs you support don't care about Peter Whitmore's opinion. The families benefiting from environmental policies you advocate for don't care about Fletcher's political theatre. You're doing real work with real impact. And that's the point. Everything else is noise. Charlotte looked at Marcus, something in her expression shifting. How do you stay so certain about what's right? You face consequences for doing your job correctly, you deal with constant scrutiny now, but you don't seem to question whether it was worth it. Marcus thought carefully before answering. I question it sometimes, but I keep coming back to the moment of decision, watching someone being made uncomfortable and choosing to act versus choosing to look away. In that moment, acting was obviously right. The consequences don't change that. Your situation is similar. You could choose the easy path, being a decorative royal who shows up for ceremonies and doesn't risk controversy. But you've chosen the harder path of trying to make genuine differences, which means facing criticism and doubt. The criticism doesn't make the choice wrong. It just makes it difficult. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. You're annoyingly wise for someone whose official job is standing around looking intimidating. I contain multitudes. Also, I don't look intimidating. I look alert and professional. You look intimidating. Ask any of the journalists who have tried to approach me at events. They're all terrified of you. Good. That's literally my job, being the person people know they have to go through to reach you. Intimidating is an acceptable side effect. The car pulled up to the palace. Charlotte sat for a moment before exiting, looking at Marcus and David. Thank you both. For the security work, obviously, but also for understanding that this job is more complicated than most people realize. You make it possible for me to do work I believe in, even when it feels impossible. After Charlotte went inside, David and Marcus stood in the palace courtyard, watching the London evening settle into night. David lit a cigarette, a habit Marcus knew he was trying to quit, and exhaled smoke into the cool air. She's going to burn out if she keeps this pace, David said quietly. The work is important to her, but the constant attacks are wearing her down. We can protect her from physical threats, but we can't protect her from the psychological toll of being perpetually under fire. What can we do? Marcus asked. Keep doing what you're doing. Being someone she can be honest with, reminding her why the work matters, giving her space to be human rather than perfectly royal. That's as much protection as tactical security, maybe more. Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility. Protecting Charlotte meant more than managing threats and coordinating security. It meant understanding her as a person, recognizing when pressure was becoming unsustainable, and providing the support she needed to continue doing work that mattered to her. As Marcus walked home that night through quiet London streets, he thought about the path that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he had been an anonymous guard making a split-second decision that changed everything. Now he was part of something larger, protecting someone, trying to use privilege for good, supporting work that made tangible differences in people's lives, being present for someone who carried burdens most people could not imagine. It was not the career he had planned. It was better, harder, more complicated, more meaningful. Exactly the kind of work that made standing between people and harm feel like more than just a job. The following months brought changes Marcus could not have anticipated. The incident with Prince Edward had created ripples that extended far beyond one uncomfortable evening. Word had spread throughout aristocratic circles about what had happened, and more importantly, about the palace's response. A guard had intervened in inappropriate behavior and had been promoted rather than dismissed. It was a small shift in institutional culture, but shifts in institutions that measured their history in centuries were significant regardless of size. Marcus began hearing stories from other palace staff. Security officers who had previously felt unable to report concerning behavior now felt more empowered to speak up. Staff members who had endured uncomfortable interactions with certain royal visitors felt less alone in their experiences. The incident had created a small crack in the wall of silence that often protected powerful people from accountability, but these changes came with resistance. Some members of the royal family viewed Marcus as a troublemaker who had violated important social boundaries. Some aristocrats who regularly attended palace events complained that security staff had become too assertive, too willing to interfere in what they considered private matters. Marcus became aware of a divide developing. People who believed his intervention had been appropriate and necessary, and people who believed he had overstepped his role in ways that threatened proper social order. The tension came to a head 8 months after the original incident, during preparations for a major royal gala. The event was significant, a fundraiser for multiple charities with hundreds of guests from across Europe's aristocracy, entertainment, and business elite. It was the kind of event where security planning required weeks of preparation, extensive coordination with multiple agencies, and the kind of precision that left no room for error. Marcus attended the planning meeting along with David, Sarah, Tom, and security chiefs from other royal family members. Commander Walsh led the meeting, walking through detailed plans for guest management, access control, emergency protocols, and protective positioning for each member of the royal family who would attend.
One particular concern,
Walsh said, pulling up a document on the screen, is the guest list. We have several individuals who have had previous security incidents at royal events. Most are minor. Excessive drinking, inappropriate behavior with staff, boundary violations. But we need to be particularly vigilant. He highlighted several names on the list. Marcus's attention locked on one of them immediately. Prince Edward Ashford. Sir, Marcus said carefully, I noticed Prince Edward is on the guest list. I was under the impression he had been excluded from palace events following the incident last year. Walsh looked uncomfortable. He was excluded from private events. This is a public fundraising gala with over 300 guests from multiple countries. The family decided that continued exclusion would raise questions and create more attention than his attendance. He'll be there with his wife, and will ensure appropriate monitoring. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Edward would be at the same event as Charlotte, the first time they would be in the same space since that dinner. The palace was prioritizing optics over Charlotte's comfort, social convention over her actual safety. Does Princess Charlotte know about this? Marcus asked. She has been informed. She expressed concerns but understood the reasoning. The event is too important to compromise over personal discomfort. Walsh's tone made clear the discussion was closed. Security for all principals will be heightened. We'll ensure Edward and Charlotte don't interact directly. After the meeting, Marcus immediately went to David. This is a mistake. We're putting Charlotte in a situation where she has to share space with someone who harassed her, where she has to maintain perfect composure while dealing with someone who made her genuinely uncomfortable. And we're doing it because excluding him would be socially awkward. David sighed heavily. I agree with you. I argued against his attendance. But the decision was made above my level. The best we can do is ensure excellent coverage and make sure Charlotte feels supported. That's not enough. Charlotte shouldn't have to be in this position at all. I know. But sometimes our job is protecting people from situations we have no power to prevent. We control what we can control: positioning, monitoring, response capability. Everything else is beyond us. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks helping prepare for the gala while privately seething at the injustice. Charlotte maintained professional detachment about the situation, but Marcus noticed increased tension in her shoulders during planning meetings, a forced quality to her smile when discussing the event. She was preparing herself psychologically to face someone who had disrespected her, knowing she would have to maintain perfect royal composure throughout. The evening of the gala arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, comfortable temperature, London at its most beautiful. The venue was the palace's largest ballroom, decorated with extraordinary floral arrangements, lit with chandeliers that had witnessed centuries of royal history, filled with people wearing their most expensive clothes and jewelry. Security was everywhere but invisible. Guards at every entrance, plainclothes officers throughout the crowd, communications networks linking everyone into a coordinated system. Marcus, David, Sarah, and Tom positioned themselves strategically around Charlotte, creating overlapping zones of protection while allowing her to move freely and interact with guests. Charlotte looked stunning in a deep blue gown, her composure perfect, her smile warm as she greeted guests. Marcus watched her work the room with practiced ease, making everyone feel welcomed and valued. She was performing royalty at its finest, gracious, elegant, genuinely interested in people's lives and work. No one watching would suspect the anxiety she must be feeling knowing Edward was somewhere in this crowd. Marcus spotted Edward about an hour into the event. He was near the bar with his wife Caroline and several other guests, drinking champagne and laughing with the easy confidence of someone who believed consequences did not apply to him. Caroline looked uncomfortable, as she always did at these events, standing slightly apart from her husband, as if creating physical distance from his behavior. Marcus activated his radio. Eagle 3 has visual on secondary concern. Position Alpha 7, near the main bar. Currently engaged with group of approximately 6 guests. Behavior appears normal. David's voice came through his earpiece. Copy that. Eagle 1 maintaining position with principal. Continue monitoring secondary concern. For the next 2 hours, Marcus maintained awareness of both Charlotte and Edward's positions, ensuring they remained separated. The ballroom was large enough that this was manageable, with Charlotte working one side of the room while Edward remained near the bar area. The separation seemed deliberate on Charlotte's part. She was carefully avoiding the sections where Edward had positioned himself. Then the evening's formal program began. Speeches were scheduled, recognizing major donors and outlining the charitable work being supported by the event. Charlotte was giving one of the speeches, along with several other speakers including a prominent businesswoman, a celebrated actor, and a member of parliament who had championed relevant legislation. Charlotte's speech was scheduled third. Marcus positioned himself near the stage, watching the audience as she spoke about the importance of supporting vulnerable communities, the power of collective action, the responsibility of privilege to create positive change. It was eloquent and heartfelt, and the audience responded with genuine appreciation. As Charlotte was concluding her remarks, Marcus noticed movement near the stage. Edward was approaching from the side, clearly intending to intercept Charlotte as she left the stage. Caroline was trailing behind him, looking anxious. Marcus moved immediately, positioning himself to block Edward's path while appearing to simply be escorting Charlotte from the stage area. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said to Charlotte as she descended the stage steps, "your next engagement is in the West Gallery. This way, please."
Charlotte understood immediately.
Marcus was creating an exit route that avoided Edward. She followed his lead, moving away from the stage and toward a different section of the ballroom. Marcus maintained position between Charlotte and Edward, who had stopped his approach but was watching with clear frustration. David appeared beside Marcus. "Eagle 1 to Eagle 3, nice work on the extraction. Secondary concern appears agitated but contained." "Copy that." Principal moving to West Gallery for continued guest engagement. Charlotte spent the next 30 minutes in the West Gallery safely separated from Edward, continuing to work the crowd with apparent ease. But Marcus noticed the tension in her shoulders, the slightly forced quality to her smiles. She was aware that Edward was here, aware that he had tried to approach her, aware that the evening required her to maintain perfect composure despite genuine discomfort. Around 10 o'clock, guests began moving toward the palace gardens where dessert and drinks were being served. The shift in venue created security complications. Multiple access points, outdoor space harder to control. Guests dispersing rather than contained in one room. Marcus, David, and the team coordinated Charlotte's movement to the gardens, establishing protective positions in the new environment. The gardens were beautiful under carefully positioned lighting, with paths winding through flowering beds and sculpted hedges. Guests scattered throughout the space, some gathering around the dessert tables, others strolling through the paths, creating a relaxed atmosphere after the formal indoor program. Marcus maintained visual contact with Charlotte as she moved through the gardens, speaking with guests, genuinely enjoying the more informal setting. He also tracked Edward, who had moved into the gardens as well and seemed to be drinking more heavily than earlier in the evening. Caroline had disappeared, possibly inside using the restroom, or perhaps simply seeking escape from her husband's increasingly loud conversation. Then Marcus noticed Edward beginning to move toward the section where Charlotte was engaged in conversation with a group of charity directors. His path was not quite direct, but it was clearly intended to intersect with Charlotte's position. Marcus moved to intercept, but the garden's layout made it difficult to position himself without being obvious about blocking Edward's access. David's voice came through the earpiece. Eagle 1, I have. Visual on secondary concerns movement. Appears intentional toward principal's position. Eagle 3, can you intercept? Eagle 3, moving to intercept. Marcus responded, altering his path to place himself between Edward and Charlotte without making it obvious he was deliberately blocking. But Edward was faster than Marcus anticipated, his path suddenly becoming more direct, covering the distance to Charlotte's group, before Marcus could position himself effectively. Edward arrived at the edge of the group, slightly unsteady on his feet, his voice carrying across the garden. Charlotte, my dear, we haven't had a chance to speak all evening. How are you? The group around Charlotte fell silent. Everyone there knew the history between Edward and Charlotte, knew that his approach was inappropriate, given past behavior. Charlotte's expression tightened, but she maintained her composure. I'm quite well, Edward. Enjoying the evening and the wonderful work our guests are supporting. Yes, wonderful work, all very noble, I'm sure. Edward's tone carried an edge of sarcasm. Though I've been meaning to speak with you about that unpleasant incident last year, the misunderstanding with your overzealous security officer who seemed to think I posed some kind of threat. Marcus felt anger flash through him, but maintained his professional demeanor, moving closer to the group while appearing simply to be monitoring the situation. David had also shifted position, both of them creating a subtle security presence without overtly intervening yet. I don't believe there was any misunderstanding, Charlotte said coolly. My security team acted appropriately based on the situation they observed. Perhaps we could discuss this at another time. I'm currently engaged with these guests. Oh, I think this is exactly the right time, with witnesses present who can appreciate how ridiculous that evening became. I was simply having a conversation with you, and suddenly I'm being treated like a criminal by staff who forgot their proper place. The charity directors in the group looked extremely uncomfortable. Several began to edge away, not wanting to be part of this confrontation. Charlotte's jaw was tight, her hands clenched at her sides, but her voice remained controlled. Edward, you've had too much to drink. I suggest you find your wife and perhaps consider calling it an evening. There you go again, treating me like a problem to be managed rather than family. I've been a supporter of this family for decades, attended hundreds of these tedious events, and this is the respect I receive? Being excluded from private gatherings, monitored like a criminal, dismissed when I try to have a simple conversation? Marcus moved forward, placing himself directly between Edward and Charlotte. He kept his voice calm but firm. Prince Edward, Princess Charlotte has asked you to leave. I'm going to need you to comply with that request. Edward's face flushed with anger. You, the hero god who created this entire mess. Do you have any idea the problems you've caused for me? The whispers, the exclusions, the humiliation of being treated like I'm somehow dangerous? Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back. If you continue to refuse, I will escort you from this event. You have no authority to do that. I was invited here, I have every right to be here, and I won't be ordered around by hired security. David had moved to Marcus's side. Actually, sir, as security chief for this event, I do have authority to remove anyone who creates a disturbance. You've been asked multiple times to leave Princess Charlotte alone. You're currently harassing her in front of witnesses. Those are grounds for removal. Other security personnel had begun moving closer, drawn by the escalating situation. Guests were watching now, some pulling out phones to record. This was exactly the kind of scene that would dominate royal coverage for weeks. A confrontation between royals, security intervening, all of it captured on camera. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice carrying absolute authority despite her distress. Edward, you need to leave now. Not because my security team is demanding it, but because I am. You've been drinking, you're creating a scene, and you're making everyone uncomfortable. Go home. I won't be ordered around by you or your attack dogs. I've done nothing wrong. You're harassing me at a charitable event after previously engaging in behavior that made me extremely uncomfortable. That's what you've done wrong. And now you're refusing to respect clear boundaries being set by multiple people. That's also wrong. Charlotte's voice was shaking slightly, but with anger rather than fear. I've been patient because of your family connections and your wife, whom I genuinely like. But that patience has limits, and you've exceeded them. Caroline appeared at that moment, looking mortified. Edward, please, let's go. You've had too much to drink and you're embarrassing both of us. I don't need you telling me what to do either. I'm perfectly fine. Marcus made a decision. Sir, I'm going to escort you to your car. You can walk voluntarily or I can call additional security to assist. Either way, you're leaving this event. Edward looked around, seeming to finally register the number of security personnel now surrounding him. The guests watching with uncomfortable fascination. His wife's mortified expression. Some calculation crossed his face, awareness that he had lost this confrontation, and that further resistance would only worsen his situation. Fine. I'll leave. But this isn't over. I'll be filing formal complaints about this treatment, about being publicly humiliated by staff. You're welcome to file whatever complaints you wish, sir. Right now, you're leaving. Marcus gestured toward the garden exit, and Edward began walking, Caroline hurrying after him, apologizing to people as they passed. Marcus and two other security officers escorted Edward to the palace entrance where his car was brought around. Edward got in without another word, Caroline following with whispered apologies. The car pulled away, and Marcus returned to the gardens where Charlotte had been moved to a quieter section, away from the crowd and the phones that had captured parts of the confrontation. Charlotte was standing with David, her composure cracking now that she was away from public view. Her hands were shaking, her breathing shallow, clearly processing the confrontation and its aftermath. I'm sorry you had to do that, Charlotte said when Marcus approached. I know removing a guest, especially one with royal connections, creates complications. You have nothing to apologize for, Marcus said firmly. Edward created the situation through his behavior. We responded appropriately. That's what we're here for. The media is going to have a field day with this. Princess's security removes royal guest, confrontation at charity gala. It will be weeks of coverage, all focused on drama rather than the charitable work the event was supposed to support. David spoke up. The footage that guests recorded shows Edward approaching you despite being asked not to, speaking inappropriately, and refusing to leave when requested. It shows you maintaining dignity while he escalated the situation. That's the narrative, and it's the truth. Let them run with that. But they won't just run with that. They'll dig into the history, bring up the dinner incident from last year, interview people with opinions about whether security overreacted. It becomes a referendum on whether I'm too sensitive, whether Edward is misunderstood, whether guards should have authority to remove anyone. Everything becomes complicated. Marcus looked at Charlotte, seeing the exhaustion and frustration beneath her controlled exterior. You're right that it will be complicated, but you were clear, direct, and appropriate in your boundaries. Edward was given multiple opportunities to comply and refused. Whatever media coverage emerges from this, you acted correctly. That's what matters. Charlotte took a shaky breath. I need a few minutes before I go back out there. Can you give me space while still maintaining position?
Of course, Your Royal Highness.
Charlotte walked to a secluded bench surrounded by flowering shrubs, sitting down and dropping her head into her hands. Marcus and David positioned themselves where they could monitor her while giving her the privacy she had requested. They watched as her shoulders shook, whether from crying or simply from releasing tension. Marcus could not tell from this distance. This is what I meant about protecting her from things we can't prevent, David said quietly. We can remove Edward, but we can't remove the stress of being put in that situation to begin with. We can document what happened, but we can't control how it's interpreted and reported. The visible threats are manageable. The invisible ones are exhausting. She shouldn't have to deal with this, Marcus said, frustration evident in his voice. Edward should have stayed excluded. The palace should have prioritized her comfort over social convention. And she shouldn't have to wonder if she'll be blamed for creating drama when all she did was set reasonable boundaries. Agreed on all counts. But here we are, managing the situation we have, rather than the one we wish we had. After 5 minutes, Charlotte stood and walked back to where Marcus and David waited. Her composure was restored, her expression controlled, ready to return to the gala and continue playing her role. But Marcus could see the cost of that restoration in the tightness around her eyes, the set of her jaw. "All right, I'm ready to go back. Let's finish this event properly and worry about the aftermath tomorrow." They returned to the gardens where the gala continued. Most guests were politely pretending nothing had happened, though Marcus noticed the increased number of people trying to approach Charlotte, ostensibly to express support, but probably more interested in hearing her version of events. Charlotte handled each interaction with grace, neither avoiding the topic nor dwelling on it, striking a balance between acknowledging what happened and refusing to make it the center of attention. The gala concluded around midnight, as guests departed and staff began the extensive cleanup required after major events. Charlotte's security team coordinated her return to her private quarters. In the car, Charlotte was silent, staring out the window at London passing by in the darkness. "Tomorrow is going to be difficult," she finally said. "Palace communications will want to coordinate statements, the media will want comments, family members will have opinions. I'll have to navigate everyone's response while managing my own feelings about what happened." "What are your feelings about what happened?" Marcus asked gently. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. "Relief, mostly. Relief that I didn't back down, that I stood up for myself clearly and directly. Relief that my security team supported me without hesitation. Relief that Edward finally faced consequences for behavior he's engaged in for years. But also anger that it came to that I was put in a position where I had to publicly confront family to protect my own boundaries. And exhaustion from knowing this becomes another story about me rather than about the charitable work we're trying to do. For what it's worth," Marcus said, "everyone who was watching saw you handle an impossible situation with dignity and clarity. You set boundaries, you stood your ground, and you did it without being cruel or excessive. That's the story that matters. I hope you're right, but I've learned that the story that matters and the story that gets told are often very different things." The next morning arrived with exactly the media coverage Charlotte had predicted. Headlines screamed about royal confrontation, security removing family members, Charlotte's alleged sensitivity, and Edward's alleged harassment. Opinions divided predictably. Some supported Charlotte's clear boundaries. Others suggested she had overreacted to innocent conversation. Edward gave interviews claiming he had been publicly humiliated for trying to reconcile after a misunderstanding. Charlotte's team released a brief statement saying she had politely asked a guest to leave after he refused to respect her clearly stated wishes. Marcus found himself once again in the media spotlight as the guard who had now twice intervened in situations involving Prince Edward. Some outlets painted him as a hero protecting Charlotte from harassment. Others suggested he was an overzealous security officer with poor judgment who turned minor social awkwardness into major incidents. His face appeared in newspapers, his background was investigated, and strangers once again felt entitled to opinions about his professional conduct. 3 days after the gala, Marcus was summoned to a meeting with Commander Walsh and Palace senior staff. He sat in the same office where he had been told 8 months earlier about his promotion, facing many of the same people who had decided his fate then. The atmosphere was tense, the expressions around the room unreadable. Lady Catherine Blackwood spoke first, her voice carrying its usual authority. "Mr. Chen, you've been involved in 2 high-profile incidents involving Prince Edward Ashford. Both incidents have resulted in significant media coverage and ongoing controversy. We need to discuss the implications and determine appropriate next steps." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Here it came. The consequence for being too visible, too controversial, too willing to create problems for the palace by actually doing his job. "We've reviewed footage from the gala, read witness statements and analyzed the sequence of events. We've also consulted with Princess Charlotte regarding her perspective." Lady Catherine paused. "The consensus is that you acted appropriately given the circumstances. Prince Edward was clearly intoxicated. He approached Princess Charlotte despite being asked not to. He refused multiple requests to leave, and his behavior constituted harassment that warranted removal from the event." Marcus blinked, surprised by the direction this was taking. "However," Lady Catherine continued, "we have a problem. Your continued involvement in situations with Prince Edward creates a narrative that is problematic for the palace. Media coverage focuses on you as the guard who challenges royalty, which is not the message we want to send. Some family members have expressed concern that your presence creates rather than prevents conflict. With respect, ma'am, I don't create conflict. I respond to situations created by other people's behavior. Prince Edward harassed Princess Charlotte twice, and I intervened appropriately both times. If that's controversial, The problem is with the behavior being addressed, not with the response. We understand your perspective. We also understand that complex institutional dynamics don't always reward correct action, particularly when that action creates discomfort for powerful people. Lady Catherine looked at Marcus with something approaching sympathy. We're not questioning whether you were right. We're acknowledging that being right has costs, especially when it challenges existing power structures. Commander Walsh spoke up. Marcus, you're an excellent protection officer. Your service record is outstanding. Princess Charlotte has repeatedly stated that she trusts your judgment and wants you on her security team. But we need to discuss how to manage the situation you're now in. What situation is that, sir? The situation where you've become more visible than protection officers should ever be, where your presence at events draws media attention, where some royal family members view you with suspicion or hostility, where doing your job correctly has made you a controversial figure. And what's the solution to that situation? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew. Lady Catherine answered. We're offering you 3 options. 1. Continue in your current role with Princess Charlotte, understanding that your visibility may create ongoing complications. 2. Accept a transfer to a different assignment within royal protection, perhaps with a family member who doesn't attend as many public events. 3. Accept an honorable discharge with full pension credit and strong recommendations, allowing you to pursue security work outside royal service. Marcus felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. Continue and remain perpetually controversial, potentially creating problems for Charlotte by association. Transfer and abandon the principal who had trusted and defended him. Or leave entirely, giving up work he found meaningful because doing it correctly made powerful people uncomfortable. Can I think about this? Marcus asked. You have 48 hours, Walsh said. After that, we need a decision so we can manage the communications and logistics. Marcus left the meeting feeling hollow. He had done everything right, protected Charlotte appropriately, handled difficult situations professionally, maintained his integrity despite pressure to do otherwise, and now he was being offered quiet exit routes because correct action had proven too disruptive to institutional comfort. That evening, Marcus met with David at the same cafe where they had first discussed Marcus joining Charlotte's team. David looked tired, lines around his eyes suggesting he had not been sleeping well. I heard about your meeting, David said. I argued against giving you this choice. I said you should continue in your role and the palace should manage the optics rather than punishing you for doing your job well. But I was overruled. I appreciate you fighting for me, but I don't know what to do. I love this work, I believe in what Charlotte is trying to accomplish, and I trust this team. But I'm becoming a liability by association. My presence draws media attention she doesn't need. Charlotte knows about your options. She's prepared to advocate for you to stay if that's what you want. But she also understands if you choose to leave. She doesn't want your career sacrificed for her benefit. Marcus stared into his coffee cup, searching for clarity that refused to come. What would you do in my position? David was quiet for a long time. I think I'd stay. I'd accept that being controversial is sometimes the price of doing important work correctly. I'd trust that the people who matter, Charlotte, our team, the people we're actually protecting, understand the value of what I do. And I'd let everyone else form whatever opinions they want because those opinions don't change the fundamental rightness of the work. That's easy to say when it's not your career on the line.
You're right.
It is easy for me to say. But I've watched you work for 8 months now. I've seen how you handle difficult situations, how you balance security and Charlotte's freedom, how you maintain integrity under pressure. That's valuable. Rare even. Walking away because you made powerful people uncomfortable would be a waste of that value. Marcus thought about Charlotte working until midnight preparing speeches to justify her existence, about children lighting up when she visited their schools, about families grateful for programs she helped fund. He thought about the meaning he had found in protecting someone trying to make genuine differences, about the team he had learned to trust completely, about the satisfaction of doing work that mattered. I'll stay, Marcus said finally. I'll accept the controversy, manage the media attention as best I can, and keep doing the job the way I believe it should be done. If that eventually costs me my career, at least I'll know I didn't compromise when it mattered. David smiled. Good. Now I can tell Charlotte she doesn't need to prepare the speech she's been writing about why you should stay. She'll be relieved. She's been writing a speech. She's been preparing arguments about your value to her security team, documentation of times you've acted appropriately under pressure, statements from staff about your professionalism. She was ready to fight the entire palace administration if necessary. You've made an impression, Marcus. Don't underestimate how much she values having someone on her team she can trust completely. Marcus returned to work the next day with a renewed sense of purpose. He informed Commander Walsh of his decision to remain in his current role, accepted that his visibility would continue creating complications, and committed to managing those complications as professionally as possible. The months that followed were indeed complicated. Media attention on Marcus continued, though it gradually faded as other royal stories emerged. Prince Edward's behavior became a topic of broader discussion, with other people coming forward about uncomfortable interactions over the years. Caroline Ashford quietly separated from her husband, moving out of their shared residence and beginning divorce proceedings. The family stopped inviting Edward to major events, his ceremonial roles were reduced, and he largely faded from public royal life. Charlotte continued her work with renewed confidence. The confrontation at the gala, while uncomfortable, had established clear boundaries that were now being respected. She expanded her charitable efforts, took on more substantive speaking engagements, and became increasingly outspoken about social issues she cared about. Marcus and the security team adapted to her evolving role, facilitating her work while maintaining appropriate protection. 1 year after the original dinner incident, Marcus found himself back in that same blue dining room. Charlotte was hosting another private dinner, this time for directors of organizations she worked with closely. The guest list had been carefully vetted, the security preparations were thorough, and Marcus stood in his familiar position outside the door with David. "Strange being back here," Marcus commented quietly. "Brings back memories," David agreed. That night changed a lot of things. Not just for you, but for how we think about security and boundaries in general. You created a precedent that others have built on. Inside, Marcus could hear Charlotte's voice as she spoke with her guests about their work and its impact. She sounded confident, engaged, genuinely happy to be having these conversations. This was what the work was for: creating space for meaningful engagement, protecting people so they could do the things that mattered to them. Marcus thought about the journey from that first dinner to this moment. The crisis, the uncertainty, the difficult choices, and ultimately the decision to stay true to what he believed was right regardless of consequences. It had been worth it. Every complicated moment, every media story, every awkward meeting with palace administrators, worth it because at the end of the day, he had protected someone doing important work, stood up for principles that mattered, and refused to compromise integrity for convenience. The evening ended peacefully. Charlotte emerged from the dining room looking satisfied, thanking her guests as they departed. After everyone had left, she paused to speak with Marcus and David. "Thank you both for everything you do. I know this hasn't been an easy year, and I know you've both dealt with complications because of your association with me. I want you to know it doesn't go unnoticed or unappreciated." "It's our honor, Your Royal Highness," David said formally. "Just doing our jobs," Marcus added, though they all knew it was more than that. Charlotte smiled. "Well, keep doing your jobs exactly as you have been. The world needs more people willing to step in when something is wrong, regardless of who's involved or what it might cost them. That kind of courage matters." As Marcus walked home that night through London streets, he reflected on Charlotte's words. Courage was not dramatic gestures or grand sacrifices. It was showing up every day and doing the right thing even when the right thing was difficult, even when it created problems, even when it would be easier to look away and pretend you saw nothing wrong. He had stepped into that drawing room 1 year ago, interrupting a private royal dinner, because someone needed protection. That single decision had transformed his career, created complications he was still navigating, and given him work more meaningful than anything he had imagined. He would make the same choice again without hesitation. Sometimes the right thing costs something, but the cost of not doing it is always higher. Marcus had learned that lesson thoroughly, and he carried it with him as he continued his work, protecting people who needed protection, standing between others and harm, doing the difficult thing because it was right. That was what it meant to serve, to protect, to be the person who stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. Not because it was easy or safe or convenient, but because in the moment of choice, there was no other option that allowed you to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. Marcus was that person. He had been tested, challenged, forced to choose between safety and principle. He had chosen principle, paid the costs, and emerged on the other side with work that mattered and a clear conscience. In a world of compromises and complicated choices, that clarity was precious. He would protect it, just as he protected Charlotte, fiercely, professionally, without hesitation or regret. That was his duty, his choice, and ultimately his purpose.